At our annual family reunion, my father stood in a grand dining room full of wealthy relatives and laughed that I had never contributed a single dime to the family legacy. He raised a crystal glass of expensive champagne, praised my younger brother for supposedly taking care of our grandfather, and publicly declared that I was nothing but a financial parasite. I sat there in silence and took every insult. But then my grandfather slowly stood up from the head of the table. He pulled a thick stack of canceled checks from his tailored jacket, tossed them onto my father's china plate, and asked him a question that instantly drained the blood from my father's arrogant face. He asked, "Who exactly paid for this $3 million house?" The engine of my 2012 Honda Civic sputtered and choked as I turned onto the sweeping gravel driveway of the massive Connecticut estate. The sound of my worn tires crunching against the immaculate white gravel felt entirely too loud. It sounded like an alarm bell ringing across the manicured lawns, announcing to the world that the family failure had finally arrived. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. My palms were sweating against the cracked leather. To my left and my right, the driveway was already lined with gleaming German engineering. There was a silver Porsche, a black Mercedes, a pristine Range Rover, and a custom Lexus. And then there was me pulling into the lineup with a dented front bumper chipped silver paint and a check engine light that had been glowing bright orange on my dashboard since last Tuesday. I am 35 years old. By any normal standard in society, I am a fully grown man capable of commanding respect. But the exact moment my cheap tires touched the property line of my family's estate, I reverted back to feeling exactly like the worthless teenager my father always told me I would become. I put the car in park, killed the struggling engine, and took a deep breath. I tried to brace my mind for the afternoon ahead. I closed my eyes and repeated my mantra. I was only here for my grandfather. Winston was the only reason I still forced myself to attend these highly toxic family reunions. But before I could even unbuckle my seatbelt or reach for the door handle, a sharp metallic rapping sound violently struck my driver's side window. I flinched, my heart jumping into my throat, and looked up. Standing just inches outside my car was my father, Richard. He was wearing a custom-tailored navy blazer that fit him perfectly, a crisp white dress shirt, and a heavy gold Rolex that probably cost more than the entire net worth of my vehicle. He was repeatedly tapping the crystal face of that expensive watch against my window glass. His face was already contorted into a deeply familiar mask of pure irritation and profound disgust. I pressed the button to roll down the window. The old motor whined in loud protest, struggling to lower the glass. I forced my mouth into a polite smile and said hello. My father did not say hello back. He did not ask how my drive was. He did not ask how my health had been since the last time we spoke 6 months ago. He simply pointed a manicured finger toward the far edge of the vast property, gesturing toward a tall row of thick privacy hedges. "Move this absolute eyesore right now," he commanded. His voice was sharp, authoritative, and loud enough for the hired valets standing near the entrance to hear clearly. "Park it around the back, behind the caterer's van. I have important clients and wealthy neighbors walking through those front gates in exactly 20 minutes, and I am not going to have them thinking we hired cheap domestic help." The words hit my chest like a physical blow. I felt a sudden, familiar heat of intense humiliation rise rapidly up my neck and flood my cheeks. I looked at the long line of luxury vehicles parked effortlessly near the front steps. I asked him softly why I could not just park next to my brother's Mercedes. It was a simple question, but it acted like a lit match dropped onto gasoline. My father let out a harsh, mocking laugh that cut right through the cool autumn air. He leaned down, placing his hands on my windowsill, invading my personal space so his face was mere inches from mine. "Are you seriously trying to compare yourself to Bradley?" My father asked, his tone dripping with absolute venom. Bradley just closed a $10 million commercial real estate fund this morning. He drove that brand new Mercedes here straight from a victory lunch with the executive board of directors. He earned his spot at the front of the house. "What exactly did you do this morning, David? Did you play with your little spreadsheets? Did you fiddle around with your meaningless data analysis?" He spat the words data analysis like it was a highly contagious disease. I kept my hands firmly planted on the steering wheel, biting the soft inside of my cheek so hard I could actually taste copper. Every single instinct inside my body screamed at me to tell him the truth right then and there. I wanted to scream that my little spreadsheets had quietly revolutionized corporate data security protocols across the country. I wanted to look him dead in the eye and tell him that I had secretly sold my boutique software firm 3 years ago for an astounding $60 million. I wanted to tell him that my bank account dwarfed his entire retirement portfolio. But I knew better. I knew exactly who my father was. If I told him that I possessed massive wealth, his visible disgust would instantly transform into greedy, relentless manipulation. I had seen him do it to his own business partners. I had watched him drain people completely dry while wearing a charming smile. Keeping my wealth a total secret was the only armor I had left against his toxic control. So I swallowed my pride. I looked down at my dusty dashboard, apologized in a quiet voice, and shifted the car back into drive. But my submission was not enough for him. It never was. "You are 35 years old, David." My father continued, completely ignoring the fact that I was already complying with his cruel demand. "You live in a cramped little apartment over a noisy street. You drive a pathetic piece of junk, and you show up here expecting a free luxury meal on my dime. When are you going to wake up and stop embarrassing the family name? Look at you. You are a grown man wearing a cheap off-the-rack suit to a formal family gathering. You are a walking, breathing disappointment." He finally stepped back from my car and aggressively dusted off his blazer as if just standing near the open window of my Honda had physically soiled his expensive clothes. Behind the caterer's van, David, he barked one last time. "And make sure you use the side entrance through the kitchen. I do not want you tracking dirt onto the marble foyer before the real guests arrive." I rolled the window up immediately, cutting off the deeply grating sound of his voice. My chest felt dangerously tight, and my breathing was rapid and shallow. I pressed my foot down on the gas pedal and drove the car around the winding side path to the back of the massive 3-story brick colonial. I found the large white delivery truck the caterers were using and hid my vehicle directly behind it exactly as I had been ordered, like a disobedient dog. I put the car in park again but did not turn off the engine right away. I sat alone in the driver's seat for a full 5 minutes, staring blankly at the steering wheel, desperately trying to calm my violently racing heart. The urge to put the car in reverse drive out of the gates and never speak to my family again was almost overwhelming. It would be so easy to just leave them behind forever. But then I reminded myself of the only thing that actually mattered today: Grandpa Winston. He was 82 years old, and his health had been quietly failing for the past 2 years. He was the only person in this entire bloodline who had ever looked at me with genuine pride instead of overwhelming pity. When my father told me that going to college for computer science was a massive waste of time and money, Winston was the one who secretly bought me my first high-performance laptop. He believed in me when the rest of them treated me like a burden. I was here to make sure he was safe, happy, and treated with respect. Nothing else mattered. Not my father's insults and not my brother's arrogant shadow. I turned off the engine and finally got out of the car. The crisp autumn air hit my face, cooling my flushed skin. I smoothed down the front of my jacket, silently acknowledging that my father was right about one thing. The suit was cheap, but it was clean and I wore it well enough. I started the long walk toward the main house. As I approached the building, I looked at the side door leading into the kitchen. The catering staff was rushing in and out, carrying trays of expensive hors d'oeuvres and crystal glasses. I remembered my father's strict order to use the servants' entrance. A sudden wave of quiet defiance washed over me. I was a member of this family regardless of how much my father hated that fact. I was not going to sneak into my own grandfather's house through the kitchen like a thief. I turned my back on the side door and walked straight toward the front of the estate. I climbed the wide, sweeping marble steps leading up to the grand entrance. The heavy double doors stood tall and imposing, crafted from solid oak and detailed with intricate brass hardware. I reached out my hand to grab the heavy brass handles, silently preparing myself for the psychological warfare waiting inside. I knew I was about to face a massive room full of arrogant aunts, boastful uncles, and the infuriatingly smug face of my brother Bradley. I braced my shoulders, took one last deep breath of the fresh outside air, and prepared to push the door open. But before my fingers could even touch the cold metal, the handle turned on its own. The heavy oak door swung open outward, pulled by someone on the inside who was stepping out to greet the new arrivals. I froze on the top step, the polite family greeting dying instantly in my throat. The air was entirely knocked out of my lungs, leaving me completely paralyzed. Standing perfectly framed in the doorway, holding a delicate crystal glass of expensive champagne and wearing a designer dress that hugged her figure flawlessly, was a woman. She looked at me, and her confident, radiant smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, undeniable contempt. My stomach plummeted directly into the ground. Out of all the terrible, toxic people inside this $3 million house, she was the one person on earth who had absolutely no right to be here. The air in the grand foyer felt unnaturally thin the exact moment I laid eyes on her. My feet were planted firmly on the top marble step, completely frozen, as the heavy oak door swung open to reveal the woman I had spent 7 years of my life with. Jessica stood perfectly framed in the entrance, draped in a stunning silver evening gown that caught the brilliant light of the massive crystal chandelier hanging above her. She looked radiant, wealthy, and entirely out of my league, and she knew it. The confident, radiant smile she had prepared for the incoming guests instantly vanished when she saw me, replaced by a look of sheer, undeniable contempt. I felt a cold, sickening drop in the pit of my stomach. This was not the residual sting of a broken heart. I had mourned the bitter end of our marriage 2 years ago. No, this was the deeply heavy realization of an orchestrated ambush. Jessica had absolutely no legal, social, or familial reason to be at this private family reunion. There was only one person petty enough, cruel enough, and powerful enough to invite my ex-wife to a family gathering just to maximize my public humiliation: my father. Richard had planned this entire scenario. He knew I was coming today specifically to check on my grandfather, and he had deliberately set a psychological trap right at the front door to break me before I even made it inside. But the absolute worst part was not simply that Jessica was here. It was the man she was firmly holding on to. Her perfectly manicured hand was wrapped tightly around the arm of Greg. Greg was my younger brother Bradley's primary business partner in his commercial real estate ventures. He was a man who wore custom Italian suits, drove imported sports cars, and spent his weekends aggressively networking at exclusive country clubs. He was the exact embodiment of everything my father valued in a man, and exactly the kind of wealthy opportunist my ex-wife had demanded I become. As I finally forced my heavy legs to move, stepping over the threshold and into the grand foyer, the lively chatter of the room began to systematically die down. Dozens of eyes turned in my direction. Aunt Susan paused mid-sentence, her champagne glass hovering near her lips. Uncle Robert lowered his voice to a hushed whisper, urgently nudging his wife to look toward the door. I could physically feel the heavy, suffocating weight of my extended family watching me. I was the main event in their favorite blood sport. They were all waiting with bated breath to see how the family disappointment would react to being publicly ambushed by his glamorous ex-wife and her wealthy new catch. I tried to keep my face completely blank. I told myself to just keep walking. I only needed to navigate through this sea of judgmental faces, find the quiet study where Grandpa Winston usually sat, and ignore the rest of the toxic noise. But Jessica was not going to let me pass quietly. She spotted my attempt to bypass the crowd, her eyes locking onto my cheap suit with the precision of a predator finding a wounded animal. A bright, dangerously sharp smile spread across her face. She let go of Greg's arm just enough to step directly into my path, effectively blocking my way to the main hallway. The lingering scent of her expensive perfume hit me immediately, a stark, painful reminder of the woman who had once constantly complained about the smell of cheap laundry detergent in our first apartment. "David," she said, her voice entirely too loud for the intimate space of the foyer. The sound of my name in her mouth carried clearly across the sudden heavy silence of the room. Her tone was dripping with that specific weaponized brand of fake pity that wealthy people use to insult you while pretending to care. "I am honestly surprised to see you here. It is really good your dad lets you visit for these things. I know how much you enjoy a free catered meal." A few muffled chuckles echoed from the surrounding relatives. I felt the familiar burning heat of shame rising rapidly in my chest, but I kept my mouth shut tight. I nodded politely, trying to step around her to the right. She shifted her weight effortlessly, mirroring my movement to keep me trapped directly under the bright light of the chandelier. Greg stood right behind her, a smug, deeply punchable smirk permanently plastered across his tanned face. He casually took a slow sip from his crystal glass, clearly enjoying watching me squirm under her gaze. I was just admiring the gorgeous renovations Richard and Bradley did to the place. Jessica continued, gesturing vaguely toward the towering vaulted ceilings and the sweeping mahogany staircase. "The estate just gets more and more beautiful every time I see it. It really highlights the stark difference between success and stagnation, doesn't it? Tell me, David, do you still live in that cramped little apartment over the noisy laundromat? The one with the leaking radiator and the peeling wallpaper?" She did not ask the question because she actually wanted to know how I was doing. She asked it to make absolutely sure that every single aunt, uncle, and second cousin in the room knew exactly how far I had fallen since the divorce. She wanted them to vividly picture me sitting in a tiny, damp room listening to washing machines spin all night while she stood here bathed in luxury and status. "I live exactly where I need to be," I said, keeping my voice low and completely even. I tried to project a calm confidence I absolutely did not feel in my shaking hands. "Excuse me, Jessica. I need to go find my grandfather right now." "Oh, do not rush off so fast," she said, reaching out to gently pat the lapel of my cheap suit jacket. Her brief touch felt like a physical burn through the thin fabric. "Greg and I have some wonderful news to share with the family, and since you are practically a stranger these days, I wanted to make sure I told you in person. Greg just bought us a stunning new place in Aspen. 5 beautiful bedrooms, a massive wraparound deck overlooking the mountains, and a private climate-controlled wine cellar. We are flying out next week on his firm's private jet to finalize the interior design choices with our architect." Greg finally spoke up, his voice booming with unearned arrogance across the quiet room. "It is a fantastic property, David. A really solid investment. You know how it is. In this world, you either build equity or you pay rent to the guys who do. Bradley actually helped me secure the commercial loan for it last month. Your brother is a real shark in the industry. You could probably learn a lot from him if you ever decided to stop messing around and get a real job." My jaw clenched so tight my teeth genuinely ached. I stared at the two of them, trying to process the absolute cruelty of this staged interaction. This was not a friendly catch-up. This was a public execution of my character. And Jessica was relishing every single second of the performance. She desperately wanted to validate her decision to leave me, and she was aggressively using the captive audience of my family to rewrite our shared history on her terms. Through her venomous tone, she continued to twist the knife deep into my chest, making sure the entire room understood exactly why she had walked away from our marriage 2 years ago. "I am just so relieved to finally be with a man who actually understands the true value of ambition," she said, leaning back against Greg's broad shoulder. He wrapped a heavy arm around her waist, pulling her close in a blatant territorial display. "You were always so absolutely terrified of moving forward, David. Do you remember when your father generously offered you a high-level position at his firm and you threw it right back in his face? You stubbornly refused to take his money. You refused to take his help. You told me you wanted to build something on your own from the ground up." She let out a harsh, bitter sigh, shaking her head side to side as if I were a tragic lost cause that she had bravely tried to save. "And look exactly where that stubborn pride got you. You are 35 years old, wearing a terrible cheap suit, driving a broken-down car, and hiding from the real world in a tiny apartment. You completely lack ambition, David. You always have. You drag successful people down like a heavy anchor. I spent 7 long years waiting for you to become a man, waiting for you to step up and claim your rightful place in this powerful family. But you just sat there in the dark, typing away on your computer, playing with your meaningless numbers, completely content with being a total failure. Every single word she spoke was a highly calculated strike designed to break me down in front of the people who already despised me. I could see the judgmental nods of agreement from my relatives out of the corner of my eye. I could see the way they whispered to each other behind their hands, fully agreeing with her vicious surgical assessment of my life. To them, I was exactly what she described. A stagnant, stubborn loser who had foolishly thrown away a golden ticket because of misplaced arrogant pride. What none of them knew, what Jessica absolutely could not comprehend with her shallow worldview, was the actual truth behind my refusal to take my father's money. I had refused his generous loan because I knew it came with heavy, invisible chains. I knew that every single dollar Richard gave me would be used to control my decisions, dictate my career path, and heavily manipulate my future. I walked away to build my own data security firm from absolute scratch. I worked grueling 20-hour days in that tiny apartment over the laundromat. I coded security protocols that eventually caught the intense attention of the largest tech conglomerates in the country. When she left me 2 years ago, screaming at the top of her lungs that I was a failure, who would never amount to anything, I was quietly finalizing the sale of my software company. I secured a $60 million buyout just 3 short weeks after our divorce was finalized by the courts. I currently had more money sitting in a secure, highly diversified offshore trust than Greg and Bradley could generate in a lifetime of their shady commercial real estate deals. The Aspen house Greg was loudly bragging about was nothing more than a heavily leveraged liability funded by dangerous debt. My wealth was absolute liquid and entirely mine. I stood there directly under the bright chandelier, looking at my ex-wife draped in expensive fabric, desperately seeking validation from the family that used her as a pawn. I looked at Greg, a man whose entire identity was tied to borrowed money and leased luxury. I had the nuclear option locked and loaded in my mind. I could have completely destroyed them both with a single quiet sentence. I could have pulled out my phone, opened my banking app, and silenced the entire foyer by showing them a net worth that would make my father choke on his champagne. I could have watched Jessica's smug, beautiful smile shatter into a million pieces of agonizing, permanent regret. But I did not. I kept my mouth completely shut. I let the harsh insults wash over me, absorbing the public humiliation without uttering a single word of defense. I swallowed the burning rage because this day was absolutely not about me, and it was certainly not about seeking petty revenge against my ex-wife. This day was about protecting my grandfather. If I revealed my massive wealth right now, the focus of the entire family would instantly shift. My father would immediately turn his manipulative sights on my money, and Grandpa Winston's peaceful existence in this house would become an active, dangerous battleground. I had to play the role of the impoverished failure just a little bit longer. I had to let them think they had won this opening battle. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my racing heart rate to steady. I looked Jessica directly in her eyes. Her gaze flickered for a fraction of a second, perhaps confused by my total lack of an emotional breakdown. She fully expected me to yell, to passionately defend myself, or to run out the front door in tears of shame. Instead, I offered her a hollow, completely emotionless smile. "I am glad you found exactly what you were looking for, Jessica," I said softly. My voice carried no anger, no sadness, and absolutely no regret. It was the dead flat tone of someone speaking to a stranger on the street. "I hope the house in Aspen brings you all the happiness you deserve. Have a good afternoon, Greg." Without waiting for a single response from either of them, I stepped firmly to the side, breaking her physical blockade, and walked past them. I could feel their eyes burning hot into my back as I moved out of the foyer and into the wide hallway leading toward the back of the estate. The cruel whispers of my relatives flared up again the very moment I was out of earshot, forming a buzzing hive of toxic gossip and judgment. I kept my eyes focused straight ahead, determined to find the quiet sanctuary of the library where Grandpa Winston always retreated during these chaotic events. I just needed to see him to verify he was comfortable, and then I could survive the rest of this nightmare. I picked up my pace, my cheap dress shoes clicking softly against the polished hardwood floors, but my escape was immediately cut short. As I rounded the corner into the long, dimly lit corridor that connected the formal dining room to the private studies, a tall figure stepped out from the shadows and planted himself squarely in the center of the hallway. It was my older brother, Bradley. He was wearing a sharply tailored slate gray suit, a silk pocket square, perfectly folded in his chest pocket, and his dark hair was impeccably styled. He held a heavy crystal tumbler filled with amber liquid and a single perfectly spherical ice cube. He leaned casually against the ornate wainscoting, his broad shoulders physically blocking my path forward. As I came to an abrupt halt, a deeply smug, deeply predatory grin slowly spread across his face. He took a slow sip of his scotch, the ice clinking loudly in the quiet hallway, and looked me up and down like I was a piece of trash that had somehow blown into his pristine home. The massive formal dining room of the Connecticut estate was intentionally designed to intimidate anyone who walked through its towering archways. The space was an absolute monument to overwhelming wealth and unchecked ego. A custom-built mahogany table stretched the entire length of the room, polished to a mirror finish that reflected the light of 3 cascading crystal chandeliers hanging heavily from the vaulted ceiling. 40 tall dining chairs, upholstered in deep burgundy velvet, were perfectly positioned along the table. Every single seat was occupied by a member of my extended family. There were wealthy uncles who ran hedge funds, aunts draped in thick diamond necklaces, and cousins who had never worked a single hard day in their entire lives thanks to massive trust funds. My father, Richard, sat at the absolute head of the table. He occupied a chair that was slightly taller than the rest, holding court like a feudal king presiding over his loyal subjects. He was in his element, surrounded by the clear visual evidence of his financial superiority. At the complete opposite end of the long mahogany table sat my grandfather, Winston. He looked small in his chair, his silver hair neatly combed, his hands resting quietly on his lap. But his eyes were incredibly sharp. He sat there in total silence, observing every single dynamic, every whispered insult, and every arrogant smirk with the steady, calculating patience of a man who knew entirely too much. I was seated near the middle of the table, purposely squeezed between my Aunt Brenda and my cousin Thomas. They were both deliberately leaning slightly away from me, acting as if the cheap fabric of my off-the-rack suit might somehow contaminate their expensive designer clothing. Directly across from me sat the architects of my public nightmare. My younger brother Bradley was seated in the place of highest honor right next to our father. To Bradley's immediate left sat my ex-wife Jessica and her wealthy new fiancé, Greg. They were a unified front of absolute arrogance. Every time a new course of food was brought out by the silent, white-coated catering staff, Jessica would lean over and whisper something into Greg's ear, heavily looking in my direction before they both shared a cruel, mocking laugh. The tension in my chest was so thick I could barely force myself to swallow the expensive filet mignon sitting on my gold-trimmed plate. I felt like a prisoner tied to a chair in the center of a Roman Colosseum, completely surrounded by a bloodthirsty crowd waiting for the main execution to begin. The clinking of heavy silver forks and the loud, boastful conversations about golf course memberships and stock portfolios echoed loudly in the cavernous room. I kept my head down. I focused intensely on the dark red grain of the mahogany table. I reminded myself over and over again that my secret was safe. I had $60 million sitting securely in an offshore trust. I was completely free from their financial control. I just had to survive this single dinner for my grandfather's sake, and then I could walk out those heavy oak doors and never look back. But my brother Bradley was absolutely never going to let me fade into the background. He thrived on the spotlight, and his favorite method of elevating himself was by firmly stepping on my neck. As the catering staff began to clear the dinner plates and pour expensive after-dinner port wine into crystal glasses, Bradley stood up from his chair. He casually picked up a silver spoon and tapped it lightly against the side of his heavy crystal tumbler. The sharp ringing sound immediately cut through the loud chatter of the dining room. Within seconds, all 40 members of our extended family fell into a hushed, respectful silence. They all turned their eager attention to the golden child of the family. Bradley buttoned the center button of his custom slate gray suit coat. He looked around the massive room with a deeply practiced smile, making deliberate eye contact with the wealthiest uncles and the most influential aunts. He soaked in their collective adoration like a sponge. "I want to propose a toast," Bradley began, his voice projecting loudly and confidently across the length of the table. His tone was perfectly calibrated to sound humble, yet heavily loaded with intense self-importance. "We are all gathered here today to celebrate family. We are here to honor the deep, unbroken legacy of success that our father Richard has so brilliantly established for us. But as I look around this magnificent room, I am mostly just incredibly thankful. I am thankful for the sheer capacity to provide." He paused dramatically, letting the weight of his words settle over the captive audience. He placed his hand flat against his chest, right over his heart, playing the role of the devoted savior to absolute perfection. 3 years ago, things looked incredibly bleak for our family. Bradley continued, his voice lowering into a tone of manufactured sadness. He looked directly down the length of the table at Grandpa Winston. "We all know that Grandpa Winston's health was failing. We all know his modest savings were running completely dry. We were facing the terrible, heartbreaking reality of moving him into a state-run, low-income care facility. It was a dark time. It was a moment that tested the true character of this family." I sat perfectly still, my eyes locked dead onto Bradley's face. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of his lie made my stomach aggressively churn. I vividly remembered exactly what happened 3 years ago. I remembered my father and Bradley sitting in a cold lawyer's office aggressively arguing that putting Winston in a cheap, underfunded facility was the only logical financial decision. I remembered them scheming to rapidly liquidate Winston's small remaining estate to cover their own toxic investment losses. They were perfectly willing to throw their own flesh and blood into a miserable state facility without a single second thought. But I was the one who stopped it. I was the one who had secretly finalized the sale of my data security software company. I was the one who quietly funneled $3.1 million through an anonymous blind trust to purchase this exact estate in cash, ensuring that my grandfather could live out his final years surrounded by comfort, dignity, and absolute peace. Bradley had contributed absolutely nothing. He had simply swooped in after the fact, taking massive advantage of the strict anonymity of the trust to boldly lie to my father and the rest of the family, claiming that his commercial real estate deals had funded the purchase. He had effectively stolen my quiet act of love and weaponized it into his own personal trophy. And when push came to shove, Bradley said, raising his glass slightly higher in the air, his voice swelling with deeply fake emotion, I knew what I had to do. I knew that the money sitting in my commercial accounts meant absolutely nothing if my own grandfather was suffering. So I stepped up. I bought this $3 million estate entirely out of pocket. I secured this home so our father and our grandfather could live exactly like the kings they truly are. Because that is exactly what real men do. Real men provide. Real men build massive shelters for the people they love. A loud murmur of profound approval rippled through the dining room. Aunt Brenda dabbed at her eyes with a linen napkin. Uncle Robert nodded his head in deep, solemn respect. My father, Richard, looked at Bradley with a level of intense, glowing pride that I had never, not once in my entire 35 years of existence, seen directed at me. Greg raised his glass to Bradley, and Jessica beamed with clear admiration. Bradley was spinning a beautiful, glorious total fiction, and the entire family was eating out of the palm of his hand. But Bradley was not satisfied with just being the undisputed hero. For his narrative to truly work, he desperately needed a villain. He needed a dark, pathetic contrast to make his shiny golden armor look even brighter. He needed me. Bradley slowly lowered his crystal glass. The fake, humble smile completely vanished from his face, replaced by a sharp, deeply predatory sneer. He turned his body slightly, directing his intense, highly judgmental gaze straight down the table until his eyes locked firmly onto mine. The entire room physically shifted their attention following his gaze. 40 pairs of highly critical eyes suddenly bore down heavily onto my cheap suit. "You see," Bradley said, his voice dropping into a cold, mocking cadence that carried perfectly through the dead silent room, "there are two distinct types of people in this world. There are those who carry the heavy weight of responsibility, and there are those who simply expect to be carried." He took a slow, theatrical step away from his chair, pacing slightly behind my father, keeping his eyes glued to my face. The absolute silence in the dining room was deafening. I could hear my own heart pounding loudly in my ears. I knew exactly what was coming. "Some of us build empires," Bradley stated, clearly enunciating every single syllable for maximum public damage. "And some of us just consume oxygen. Isn't that right, David?" The raw cruelty of the question hung suspended in the air. A few of my younger cousins let out sharp, quickly stifled giggles. Jessica covered her mouth with her hand to hide a massive, incredibly vicious smirk. Greg crossed his arms over his chest, thoroughly enjoying the public execution. Bradley leaned forward, resting his hands on the back of my father's tall chair, looking at me like I was a highly offensive stain on the expensive dining room rug. "I honestly want to know how you sleep at night, David. You are 35 years old. You live in a miserable apartment. You drive a car that looks like it belongs in a junkyard. You bring absolutely nothing of value to this family. You have never contributed a single dime to grandfather's care, and yet here you are sitting at my beautiful table eating the expensive food that my hard work paid for." He gestured vaguely toward my half-empty plate. "Enjoy the steak," he sneered, his voice completely devoid of any human empathy. "It's probably the only one you'll eat this year." The room erupted into a chorus of low, mocking laughter. The humiliation was so thick, so deeply oppressive, that it felt like the walls of the grand room were aggressively closing in on me. I stared straight ahead, my jaw locked so incredibly tight that a sharp pain shot entirely through my skull. My hands were resting flat on my lap beneath the heavy mahogany table. My knuckles were completely white. The skin pulled incredibly tight over the bone as I gripped the fabric of my own trousers to stop myself from standing up and physically tearing the smug smile right off his arrogant face. I wanted to ruin him. I wanted to stand up, pull the encrypted banking application open on my phone, and shove my $60 million account balance directly into his face. I wanted to expose his massive lie right in front of the 40 people he was trying so desperately to impress. But the suffocating weight of my father's toxic presence kept me firmly anchored to my chair. If I exposed the truth right now, the money would immediately become the only thing that mattered. Grandpa Winston would lose his peace. The house would become a brutal war zone. Before I could even process the intense wave of burning anger flooding my system, my father decided to join the public slaughter. Richard nodded his head in firm, deeply serious agreement with Bradley's vicious assessment. He picked up his own crystal glass and pointed it aggressively in my direction. "Your brother is absolutely right, David." My father said, his voice loud, booming, and filled with total disgust. "You have become nothing but a financial parasite. You drain resources and offer absolutely nothing in return. You sit there in your cheap clothes with your foolish, stubborn pride, pretending that your meaningless little data entry job makes you better than the rest of us. It is deeply pathetic. You are a completely stagnant failure, and you are dragging the family reputation straight through the mud." A financial parasite. The label echoed loudly in the cavernous dining room. Aunt Brenda actually sighed in agreement. Uncle Robert shook his head, looking at me with pure, unadulterated pity. Jessica leaned into Greg, her eyes shining with absolute vindication. She was finally getting the public validation she had desperately craved since she walked out on our marriage. The entire family was firmly united in their profound disdain for me. My vision actually blurred slightly from the intense surge of adrenaline pumping rapidly through my veins. The urge to fight back, to scream the absolute truth until my lungs bled, was a physical pressure building violently inside my chest. I took a sharp, shallow breath, trying desperately to maintain my blank, emotionless expression. Slowly, carefully, I shifted my gaze away from the cruel, mocking faces of my father and my brother. I looked directly down the massive length of the mahogany table, past the crystal centerpieces and the silver candelabras. I looked all the way to the far end of the room, straight into the quiet, calculating eyes of Grandpa Winston. He had not laughed. He had not nodded in agreement with their vicious insults. He sat perfectly upright in his chair, his hands still resting calmly on his lap. As my eyes locked onto his, the loud, chaotic noise of the mocking family seemed to fade slightly into the background. Grandpa Winston held my gaze with intense, unwavering clarity. Slowly, deliberately, he gave me a single, incredibly subtle nod. It was a highly specific gesture. It was a silent, powerful command to hold my ground. It was an acknowledgement that he knew exactly what was happening. He knew exactly who had truly bought this house, and he knew exactly how this entire disgusting charade was going to end. That tiny, simple movement anchored me entirely to reality. The burning heat in my chest immediately cooled into something much harder, something incredibly cold and heavily calculated. I loosened the desperate white-knuckle grip on my trousers. I uncurled my fingers and placed my hands flat on the top of the mahogany table. I did not say a single word. I simply stared back at my father and my brother, my face a completely blank mask of total indifference. My silence did not diffuse the situation. In fact, my calm, quiet defiance infuriated my father more than any screaming argument ever could have. Richard despised nothing more than losing absolute control over an emotional narrative. The fact that I was not breaking down, that I was not apologizing or crying in front of the family, sent him into a very real, very dangerous rage. Richard's face turned a deep, unhealthy shade of crimson. His jaw muscles flexed aggressively as he slammed his crystal glass down hard onto the mahogany wood. The loud, sharp crack of the heavy glass hitting the table silenced the lingering laughter of the relatives immediately. The atmosphere in the dining room instantly shifted from cruel mockery to highly dangerous tension. Richard placed both of his hands flat on the table and slowly, intimidatingly stood up from his tall chair. He loomed over the gathering, his chest heaving with highly suppressed fury. He glared down at me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred, preparing to deliver a final, devastating blow that he believed would crush me permanently into the dirt. My father stood at the absolute head of the long mahogany dining table, his tall frame casting a heavy shadow over the crystal glassware and the expensive silver platters. The air in the room grew entirely stagnant. The sudden silence was so absolute that I could hear the faint, steady ticking of the antique grandfather clock out in the main hallway. 40 members of my extended family sat completely frozen, their eyes darting nervously between my father and me. Richard did not just want to insult me in passing. He wanted to make an example out of me. He wanted to completely break my spirit in front of a captive audience, ensuring that every single person in our bloodline knew exactly what happened to anyone who defied his narrow definition of success. My father smoothed the lapels of his custom navy blazer, clearing his throat with a sharp, authoritative sound. He looked around the room, taking a moment to make deliberate eye contact with my aunts, my uncles, and finally my younger brother Bradley. Bradley sat there with a deeply satisfied smirk plastered across his perfectly tanned face, swirling the ice in his Scotch glass. He looked like a prince waiting for his formal coronation. Then my father turned his intense, burning gaze back down the length of the table, locking his eyes directly onto mine. "I have a very important announcement to make regarding the future of this family." My father began, his voice echoing loudly off the vaulted ceilings. "I have spent my entire life building our reputation. I have worked tirelessly to ensure that our name commands respect, power, and influence in the business world. I expect my children to carry that heavy torch forward. Bradley has proven himself more than capable of handling that massive responsibility. He has shown incredible ambition. He has secured this beautiful $3 million estate for us. He is a true leader. But a family is only as strong as its weakest link, and I absolutely refuse to allow a weak link to drag my legacy straight down into the dirt." A cold, heavy knot formed deep in my stomach. I knew exactly where this was going. I had seen him use his money as a weapon countless times before, but never with this level of orchestrated public cruelty. This coming Monday morning, my father continued, his voice growing dangerously cold. "I am sitting down with my primary estate attorneys. I am completely restructuring my financial portfolio, my living trusts, and my last will and testament. As it stands right now, my assets are designed to be split equally among my children. But I have realized that giving millions of dollars to a man who fundamentally refuses to work is not an act of fatherly love. It is an act of sheer financial negligence. Therefore, I am officially writing you out of my will, David. I am completely disinheriting you. You will not receive a single dime from my estate. You will not receive any property, any stock options, or any liquid capital. You will be entirely cut off." A collective muffled gasp rippled through the dining room. Aunt Susan pressed her hand against her pearl necklace, her eyes wide with shock. Uncle Robert slowly shook his head, looking down at his plate as if he were witnessing a tragic but entirely necessary execution. I felt the intense burning stares of 40 people pressing down heavily onto my shoulders. They were waiting to see me crack. They fully expected me to immediately burst into tears, to fall to my knees to beg my father for forgiveness and mercy. But I did not move a single inch. I sat firmly in my velvet chair, keeping my breathing perfectly steady, my face completely devoid of any emotion. My father paused, clearly waiting for my desperate reaction. When I offered him nothing but absolute silence, his jaw muscles tightened aggressively. He leaned forward, resting his fists firmly on the polished wood of the table. However, my father said, his tone shifting into something that sounded like manufactured mercy. "I am not an entirely heartless man. I believe in redemption. I believe that even a stagnant, stubborn failure can be rehabilitated if they are finally forced to face reality. I will keep your name in my last will and testament, David, but only if you meet one very specific non-negotiable condition." I kept my eyes locked on his, refusing to look away, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me intimidated. "You will abandon your worthless little tech hobbies," my father commanded, his voice rising in volume. "You will stop hiding in your cheap apartment playing with your meaningless spreadsheets. On Monday morning at exactly 8 o'clock, you will walk into Bradley's commercial real estate firm. You will wear a proper suit. You will hand your younger brother your resume, and you will politely beg him for a job as an entry-level administrative assistant. You will fetch his coffee. You will file his contracts. You will answer his phone calls, and you will learn from the absolute bottom what real grinding work actually looks like. If you humble yourself, if you completely submit to Bradley's leadership and prove that you can be a productive member of society, I will consider keeping you in the family trust. If you refuse, you are dead to me financially." The sheer breathtaking absurdity of his demand almost made me laugh out loud. I was sitting there listening to a man boldly demand that I, a tech founder who had just secured a $60 million buyout, go fetch coffee for a younger brother who was secretly drowning in $4 million of toxic debt. The entire situation was a massive, incredibly dark comedy. But nobody else in the room knew the punchline. To them, my father was acting like a generous saint, offering a golden lifeline to a drowning, impoverished loser. The societal pressure in the dining room immediately skyrocketed. The family eagerly jumped on the opportunity to dogpile on the designated black sheep. "You really need to listen to your father, David," Uncle Robert said loudly from across the table, waving his silver fork in my direction. "He is giving you a massive handout. You have been coasting through life for way too long. Bradley is a very successful man. Working under him would be the best thing that ever happened to your career. You should be down on your knees thanking him for the opportunity." Aunt Susan chimed in immediately, her voice dripping with extreme condescension. "Do not let your foolish pride ruin your entire future, David. We all want to see you succeed, but you have to be willing to start at the absolute bottom. Bradley is being incredibly gracious, even allowing you into his corporate office." The heavy avalanche of unearned advice and toxic judgment continued to pour over me. But the most vicious strike did not come from my aunts or my uncles. It came from my ex-wife. Jessica leaned aggressively across the table, completely ignoring the massive floral centerpiece separating us. She wanted to make absolutely sure her voice cut through the noise of the family. "Just say thank you, David," Jessica sneered, her eyes flashing with pure, highly concentrated malice. "Stop being so incredibly stubborn and utterly ungrateful. This is exactly why our marriage fell apart. You constantly refuse to accept reality. You always think you are somehow smarter than everyone else in the room, but you have absolutely nothing to show for it." She reached over and placed her hand affectionately over Greg's expensive suit sleeve, using her new wealthy fiancé as a shiny prop to brutally bludgeon my character. "Greg understands how the real world works," she continued loudly. "Greg built his portfolio by aggressively chasing opportunities, not by sitting in a dark room feeling sorry for himself. Your father is handing you a massive career on a silver platter. Take the assistant job, David. Swallow your massive unearned pride before you end up completely homeless. It is genuinely embarrassing to watch you destroy your own life like this." I stared at Jessica. I looked at the way her diamond earrings caught the light of the chandelier. I looked at Greg, who was nodding along with her speech like a wise, benevolent mentor dealing with a troubled child. I looked at Bradley, who was practically glowing with immense toxic satisfaction as the entire family worshipped at the altar of his completely fabricated success. They were all entirely trapped in a massive collective delusion. They truly believed that money equated to moral superiority, and because they believed I had no money, they felt completely entitled to strip away every single ounce of my human dignity. I felt the familiar burning rage building heavily in my chest. The intense desire to utterly obliterate their arrogant world was a physical pressure pushing violently against my ribs. But then I slowly shifted my gaze to the far end of the long table. Grandpa Winston was still sitting there. He was watching the chaotic, hateful circus with a look of profound, quiet sorrow. He looked incredibly tired of the greed, tired of the constant comparisons, and entirely tired of the toxic poison that had deeply infected his own son. He gave me a very small, very subtle look of encouragement. It was a silent reminder to stay perfectly grounded. I drew a long, slow breath through my nose. I forced the heavy anger down, burying it deep beneath a thick layer of absolute freezing calm. I let the family continue their murmurs and their quiet, judgmental whispers for a few more seconds. I let them exhaust their hateful energy. Then I sat up slightly straighter in my velvet chair. I placed my hands together on the table, interlacing my fingers in a deeply relaxed, non-threatening posture. I turned my head and looked directly at my father. I did not raise my voice. I did not let a single trace of anger, bitterness, or intimidation leak into my tone. I spoke with the perfectly measured, polite cadence of a man declining a second serving of dessert. "I appreciate the offer, Dad," I said calmly, making sure my voice carried clearly to the absolute corners of the massive room. "I truly do understand what you are trying to do here, but I'm going to have to politely decline. I will not be going to Bradley's office on Monday morning, and I will not be taking a job as his assistant. You can go ahead and update your will however you see fit. I do just fine with my data analysis." The dining room instantly plunged back into a state of absolute deafening silence. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Bradley let out a loud, mocking scoff, throwing his hands up in the air in an exaggerated display of utter disbelief. Greg actually laughed out loud, shaking his head side to side as if my stupidity was the most entertaining thing he had seen all year. Jessica rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might get permanently stuck in the back of her skull. But my father did not laugh. My father did not scoff. My calm, completely polite refusal caused something inside of his brain to violently short-circuit. He was entirely prepared for an aggressive argument. He was prepared for me to yell to passionately defend my pride or to eventually break down and beg for his money. He was absolutely not prepared for me to calmly, indifferently brush off his massive financial threat as if it were completely meaningless. To a man who believed that his wealth gave him total, unquestionable authority over the universe, my quiet indifference was the ultimate unforgivable insult. It was a direct, lethal challenge to his power as the family patriarch. Richard's face rapidly drained of its previous deep red color, instantly turning an incredibly dangerous pale shade of white. The refined, aristocratic mask he wore so carefully in high society completely shattered into pieces. He lost all sense of decorum. He lost all sense of control. He raised his right hand high into the air and brought it violently crashing down onto the mahogany dining table. The massive, explosive slam sounded like a heavy gunshot echoing through the formal room. Crystal wine glasses tipped over and shattered against the wood. Expensive silverware violently clattered against the china plates. Several of my aunts physically jumped in their chairs, letting out sharp, startled gasps of genuine fear. "You ungrateful, arrogant little parasite!" My father roared, his voice completely unhinged and shaking with raw, uncontrolled fury. He leaned across the table, pointing a violently trembling finger directly at my face. "You think you are above this family. You think your pathetic, impoverished life somehow makes you morally superior to us. I try to save you from your own miserable failures, and you sit there and disrespect me in front of this entire gathering." I did not flinch. I kept my eyes locked entirely on his, maintaining my dead-flat expression. My silence only poured more gasoline onto the raging fire of his anger. "I am completely done with you, David," my father screamed, his chest heaving aggressively under his expensive tailored suit. "You are no longer my son. You do not deserve to breathe the same air as the successful people in this room. I will not allow you to sit here and disrespect your brother after everything he has done to provide for this family. I want you out of my sight right now." He stood completely upright, his eyes wide and frantic, looking toward the heavy double doors leading to the main hallway. "I will have the private estate security drag you out of here by the collar of your cheap jacket," he threatened loudly, his voice echoing brutally off the walls. "I will have you physically thrown off Bradley's property this very second. Get out." The violent threat of physical eviction hung heavily in the air. The words "Bradley's property" echoed loudly in my ears. This was it. This was the absolute breaking point. My father had finally pushed the false narrative entirely too far. He had openly weaponized a massive absolute lie to try and physically remove me from the only home my grandfather had left. I felt a sudden, massive shift in the atmosphere of the room. The time for biting my tongue was completely over. The time for maintaining a peaceful silence to keep the peace had officially expired. I slowly placed my hands flat on the table, preparing to finally unleash the truth that would burn this entire arrogant fantasy straight to the ground. But before I could even push my chair back to stand up and face my screaming father, another sound cut sharply through the heavy tension. My father's furious voice bounced off the high-vaulted ceilings of the dining room, vibrating through the crystal chandeliers and sinking deep into the heavy mahogany table. "Get out!" He had screamed, his face a mask of absolute unhinged rage. The command hung in the stifling air, thick and heavy. Aunts and uncles held their breath. Jessica watched me with hungry, predatory eyes, waiting for me to completely shatter. But sitting there in my cheap off-the-rack suit, staring at the man who had spent 35 years trying to make me feel incredibly small, I felt absolutely no fear. I felt no urge to cry. no desperate need to apologize, and certainly no desire to run away. Instead, a profound, icy calm washed over my entire body. I watched my father heave violent breaths of angry air, and I almost felt sorry for him. He was completely blind. He was standing inside a house he did not own aggressively, defending a favorite son who was a total fraud, and screaming at the only person in the room who held the actual legal power to destroy them both. As my father continued to glare at me, waiting for his harsh words to finally break my spirit, my mind briefly pulled back to the massive reality I had kept completely hidden from them all. 3 years ago, my life was exactly what they all thought it was. I was exhausted, chronically overworked, and living in that cramped, miserable apartment above the noisy laundromat. But I was absolutely not stagnant. While Bradley was out at exclusive country clubs shaking hands and leasing imported sports cars on high-interest credit to look incredibly successful, I was sitting in the dark, writing thousands of lines of complex code. I spent 7 grueling years in that tiny apartment, while the heavy commercial washing machines violently shook the floorboards beneath my cheap desk. I was building advanced encryption algorithms designed to protect international banking networks. I survived on cheap coffee and frozen meals. Jessica had screamed at me daily, telling me I was wasting my life. She desperately wanted me to quit my foolish little hobby and go beg my father for a junior executive role. She wanted the instant gratification of a leased luxury car and a fake country club membership to excitedly show off to her shallow friends. But I flatly refused to sell my soul to a man who viewed his own children as disposable corporate assets. My dedication eventually paid off in a way none of them could possibly comprehend. When a massive global tech conglomerate finally approached me, they did not just buy my software. They bought my absolute financial freedom. The buyout was swift, quiet, and completely confidential. The $60 million wire transfer cleared on a Tuesday afternoon. I had sat completely alone in my silent apartment, staring at the banking portal on my phone until my eyes physically burned. I could have bought a massive penthouse in Manhattan that very day. I could have driven a brand new sports car straight up my father's gravel driveway, walked right into his office, and dropped my staggering bank statement directly onto his pristine mahogany desk. But I made a very conscious, highly calculated decision the day that money hit my account. I told absolutely no one. I knew my family perfectly. I knew the horrifying reality of sudden wealth. Money does not magically fix deeply toxic families. It only aggressively magnifies their inherent greed. If I revealed my success, Richard would not have been proud of my hard work. He would have immediately calculated exactly how to manipulate and leverage my capital to aggressively expand his own legacy. Jessica would have completely erased her active plans for divorce, choosing instead to stay and bleed my accounts entirely dry while continuing to secretly despise me. Bradley would have endlessly demanded massive bailouts for his shady real estate ventures. My wealth would not have earned their respect. It would have only made me their ultimate highly lucrative target. Silence was my ultimate fortress. My poverty was a carefully constructed, brilliant shield that kept the worst, most toxic people in the world entirely out of my life. I kept my cheap car. I kept my cheap apartment. I let them all keep calling me a pathetic loser. My hidden wealth remained completely untouched until the exact day my grandfather actually needed it. The memory of that fateful meeting in my father's office 3 years ago still made my stomach aggressively churn with fresh disgust. Grandpa Winston had just returned from a brief, frightening hospital stay after a minor heart attack. His heart was weak. He was incredibly vulnerable, and for the first time in his long, hard-working life, he was entirely dependent on his family for support. My father had paced aggressively in front of his massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, complaining loudly to Bradley about the sheer unbearable financial inconvenience of elder care. Bradley had sat comfortably on a leather sofa, casually checking the time on his heavy gold watch, profoundly annoyed that his busy afternoon was being completely wasted discussing the fate of an old man. They did not speak about Winston like he was a human being, let alone the generous patriarch who had given them everything. They coldly spoke about him like he was a rapidly depreciating asset that was severely hurting their quarterly margins. "We cannot just throw good money into a bottomless pit," my father had argued, coldly waving his hand in total dismissal. "He is only going to get worse, Richard. It is a terrible investment." Bradley had readily agreed, eagerly leaning forward to pitch his incredibly disgusting calculated plan. "There is a state-funded facility right on the county line," Bradley had said smoothly. "It is perfectly adequate for someone in his fading condition. If we immediately transition him there, we can rapidly liquidate his remaining modest investment accounts, sell off his personal assets, and roll that cash directly into my new commercial fund to offset our recent market losses." They deeply wanted to strip a proud, loving, hardworking man of his basic human dignity just to violently balance their own messy spreadsheets. They were perfectly willing to throw their own grandfather into a bleak, depressing, underfunded institution just to line their own pockets with his final few dollars. The absolute chilling depravity of their conversation cemented my decision forever. I would never under any circumstances allow them to touch a single penny of my massive wealth, and I would absolutely never let them destroy my grandfather. I did not argue with them in that cold corporate office. Arguing with completely unhinged narcissists is a massive waste of breath. I simply stood up, walked out the heavy glass door, picked up my phone, and immediately called my private estate attorneys. Within 48 hours, I had legally established a massive, anonymous, highly secure corporate entity. I ordered my legal team to locate the absolute best piece of available real estate in the entire state of Connecticut. They quickly found this sprawling $3.1 million estate with massive manicured grounds, wide accessible hallways, and absolute quiet privacy. I bought the entire property in full, paying completely in cash directly from my offshore blind trust. I immediately hired a rotating staff of private medical professionals to be on call around the clock. And then, through my lawyers, I sent a formal, legally binding invitation to Grandpa Winston, officially informing him that an anonymous benefactor had secured the estate for his permanent, unconditional use. I effectively saved him from the miserable, humiliating fate my father and brother had eagerly planned. But I severely underestimated the absolute bottomless depths of my brother's total lack of basic morality. When the family discovered that a massive, completely anonymous trust had purchased the estate for Winston, Bradley saw the ultimate golden opportunity to permanently elevate himself above me. Bradley was secretly drowning. His highly praised commercial real estate fund was a complete disaster. He was millions of dollars in aggressive debt, desperately moving borrowed money between hidden accounts just to miraculously stay afloat. But he desperately needed to maintain the grand illusion of total success to keep his wealthy investors' people exactly like his partner Greg from instantly pulling their capital and ruining him. So Bradley did the unthinkable. He boldly claimed complete credit for my quiet work. He walked straight into my father's office and told a magnificent, bold-faced lie. He claimed that he was the anonymous benefactor all along. He told Richard that he had structured the massive purchase quietly through a blind trust for tax evasion purposes, but that the $3.1 million came directly from his own incredible, unmatched success. My father had actually wept with deep, overwhelming pride. He hailed Bradley as the ultimate family savior, the true, undisputed heir to the family throne. And Bradley eagerly accepted every single ounce of that unearned, stolen praise. He permanently moved into the master suite of the house, living completely rent-free on my property, pretending to be a wealthy king while secretly standing right on the very edge of total catastrophic financial ruin. Now, 3 years later, that exact same desperate, pathetic fraud was standing in my formal dining room, aggressively posturing for an audience of fools who blindly worshipped his magnificent lie. My father's furious echoing command for me to leave the house still hung heavily in the dead, silent room. Richard was breathing heavily, his face tight with blinding anger, waiting for the hired estate security to come and physically throw me out onto the street. But Bradley deeply wanted the personal glory of doing it himself. He wanted to look impossibly strong. He wanted to physically dominate me right in front of Jessica and Greg to definitively prove that he was the superior alpha male of the family. Bradley confidently pushed his tall velvet chair back from the mahogany table. The heavy wooden legs scraped incredibly loudly against the polished hardwood floor. He casually tossed his white linen napkin onto his half-eaten filet mignon and began to slowly, deliberately walk around the perimeter of the massive table. The entire family watched in tense, completely breathless silence as the shining golden child directly approached the impoverished black sheep. I could see Jessica biting her lower lip in eager, malicious anticipation. I could see Uncle Robert aggressively leaning forward, his eyes wide, desperately wanting to get a better view of my impending public destruction. Bradley stopped right next to my chair. He did not say a single word at first. He just stood there, towering heavily over me aggressively, using his physical height and the sharp cut of his tailored suit to project total, unquestionable dominance. I slowly turned my head and looked straight up at him. The contrast between us in that singular defining moment was absolutely staggering. Bradley was practically vibrating with desperate, nervous energy. His entire identity, his entire bloated sense of self-worth completely depended on his ability to make me feel incredibly small. He needed me to cower. He needed me to publicly validate his fake superiority. Because deep down in the dark, quiet hours of the night, Bradley knew he was a total failure. He knew he was drowning in massive debt. He knew he was living a complete lie. His physical aggression was nothing more than a highly transparent shield to hide his absolute consuming terror. On the other hand, I sat there feeling perfectly weightless. I was completely anchored by the absolute truth. I did not need to scream or flex my jaw or threaten physical violence to successfully prove my strength. I held the actual deed to the ground he was currently standing on. I held the bank accounts that could effortlessly wipe his entire commercial firm off the map in a single afternoon. I looked at his desperate, aggressive posture, and I did not feel an ounce of fear. I only felt a profound, chilling sense of finality. The long, painful charade was finally coming to an end. The heavy curtain was about to permanently fall on his pathetic performance. His eyes were completely cold, entirely dead, filled with a highly toxic mixture of supreme arrogance and deep-seated hatred. He leaned down slowly, placing his manicured hands firmly on the wooden armrests of my velvet chair, physically trapping my body in the seat. He brought his face so incredibly close to mine that I could clearly smell the sharp, expensive scotch lingering on his breath. His jaw muscles flexed violently as he prepared to use pure physical intimidation to force me to finally submit, to make me stand up, lower my head, and run away from my own home like a frightened, beaten child. He leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing into dark slits, completely unaware that he was aggressively trying to physically intimidate the only man in the world who could legally have him arrested for trespassing. The heavy silence in the massive, formal dining room felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. Bradley leaned in so incredibly close to me that his presence completely invaded my personal space. The sharp, overwhelming scent of his expensive designer cologne aggressively mixed with the heavy smell of the aged scotch lingering on his breath. His jaw muscles twitched violently beneath his perfectly tanned skin. He was staring down at me with a look of absolute, unadulterated hatred. He was standing there waiting for me to crack under the immense pressure of his intimidation. He wanted me to physically shrink away from him. He desperately needed me to lower my eyes, to apologize to our father, and to run out of the room like a frightened, beaten dog. That was how the family dynamic was supposed to work. That was the only script Bradley knew how to follow. But I simply sat there, keeping my posture perfectly straight. my hands resting completely flat and calm against the polished mahogany wood of the dining table. I stared directly back into his dark, furious eyes. I did not blink. I did not break eye contact. My absolute lack of fear was a total rejection of his carefully constructed authority. To a man who secretly lived his entire life in a state of constant suffocating panic over his massive financial debts, my quiet, unshakable confidence was the ultimate insult. It completely broke his brain. Bradley could not handle the fact that the impoverished, designated loser of the family was not terrified of him. His eyes suddenly flared with a bright, dangerous flash of pure aggression. He let out a sharp, frustrated breath through his nose. He took one step closer, raised his right hand, and violently shoved my left shoulder. The physical impact was surprisingly hard. The sudden force of his heavy hand aggressively jolted my entire body backward. My upper back slammed firmly against the thick velvet upholstery of my dining chair. The cheap fabric of my suit jacket pulled awkwardly against my shoulders. A few of the heavy silver utensils resting near my plate loudly rattled against the fine china from the sudden vibration of the physical assault. Several members of my extended family let out sharp, startled gasps. Aunt Susan physically jumped in her seat. Uncle Robert defensively crossed his arms over his chest. Even Jessica, my ex-wife, widened her eyes in genuine surprise, instinctively pulling back slightly from the table. Physical violence was absolutely not something that happened at our highly refined, incredibly wealthy family gatherings. But Bradley had completely lost his fragile grip on reality. "Get out of my house, you broke loser!" Bradley spat. His voice was a harsh, venomous hiss that carried perfectly across the dead silent dining room. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, his chest heaving aggressively under his custom slate gray suit. "You are completely upsetting, Dad. You are ruining this entire family gathering. You walk in here in your cheap clothes reeking of failure, and you have the absolute audacity to disrespect the people who provide for you. I will not tolerate your toxic, pathetic presence in my home for one more second. Get up and get out." He raised his voice even louder on the last two words, making sure that his aggressive command violently bounced off the towering, vaulted ceilings. He was fully playing to his captive audience. He was desperately trying to position himself as the strong, fiercely protective son who was bravely defending his elderly father from a disrespectful, impoverished parasite. He wanted Jessica to see how incredibly powerful he was. He wanted Greg, his wealthy business partner, to see how decisively he handled conflict. He was aggressively feeding his own massive, fragile ego by trying to publicly butcher my dignity. I looked at the heavy, manicured hand that had just shoved me. I looked at the expensive gold watch wrapped tightly around his wrist, a watch that I knew for an absolute fact was purchased with heavily leveraged credit. I looked up into his flushed, furiously sweating face. I did not feel a single ounce of fear. I did not feel any sudden, blinding urge to stand up and start a pathetic, chaotic fistfight in the middle of a formal dining room. I felt something entirely different. I felt a profound, chilling sense of clinical detachment. I was looking at a man who was entirely built out of cheap glass and fragile lies, standing inside a massive fortress of stone that belonged entirely to me. I let the heavy, suffocating silence stretch out for 10 long, agonizing seconds. I purposefully let his aggressive, panting breaths echo loudly in the quiet room. I let the extreme tension physically suffocate every single person sitting at that long mahogany table. I knew that the longer I waited to speak, the more terrified he would become. Slowly, deliberately, I leaned my body forward again. I ignored the dull, throbbing ache in my shoulder where he had violently shoved me. I placed my elbows calmly on the edge of the dining table. I kept my face a completely blank, totally emotionless mask. I looked Bradley dead in his dark, furious eyes. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I spoke with the soft, perfectly steady, incredibly cold cadence of an absolute executioner delivering a final, unavoidable verdict. "Your house." "Bradley," I asked. My words were incredibly quiet, but they cut right through the heavy atmosphere of the room like a perfectly sharpened steel blade. Are you absolutely sure about that? The immediate physical reaction to my simple, quiet question was nothing short of extraordinary. The absolute breathtaking transformation of Bradley's face is an image that will permanently be burned into my memory for the rest of my natural life. The furious, self-righteous anger that had fully consumed his features vanished in a microscopic fraction of a second. It was instantly replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated absolute terror. The thick, arrogant color rapidly drained out of his perfectly tanned cheeks, leaving his skin looking horribly pale and sickly white, his dark pupils violently dilated. I watched his throat bob aggressively as he swallowed a thick, sudden lump of pure panic. The heavy crystal tumbler of scotch that he was tightly gripping in his left hand began to visibly tremble. The single spherical ice cube rattled loudly against the thick glass, broadcasting his sudden, uncontrollable physical shaking to the entire silent room. He knew. In that single, frozen moment of time, Bradley realized exactly what was happening. He realized that the quiet, impoverished brother he had relentlessly mocked for his entire life somehow knew the absolute devastating truth. He did not know exactly how I had discovered his massive secret. He did not know how I knew that he was secretly drowning in $4 million of toxic commercial debt. He did not know how I knew that his grand, boastful story about buying this $3 million estate was a complete fabricated lie. But the absolute, unwavering certainty in my steady voice completely shattered his fragile, arrogant reality. I saw the desperate, frantic calculations running aggressively behind his panicked eyes. If I knew the truth about the house, then I held the ultimate power to permanently destroy his entire life. If I spoke the truth out loud right now, our father would instantly disown him. His wealthy business partner, Greg, would completely pull his commercial funding. He would be totally ruined, left with nothing but massive debt and a permanently shattered reputation. The sheer terror of that looming catastrophic reality hit Bradley like a speeding freight train. He could not defend himself with logic because he had absolutely none. He could not calmly argue with me because any prolonged conversation would inevitably force the devastating truth out into the open air. The only defense mechanism a cornered, panicked narcissist has left when their massive lies are finally threatened is extreme, overwhelming, chaotic volume. Bradley desperately needed to immediately silence me before I could say another word. He needed to physically remove me from the room before I could burn his entire fake empire straight to the ground. Bradley aggressively took a large step backward, stumbling slightly over his own expensive leather shoes. His chest heaved violently as he desperately sucked in a massive breath of air. He completely lost every single ounce of his refined, wealthy country club persona. His face twisted into a mask of pure, desperate hysteria. "Security!" Bradley screamed at the absolute top of his lungs. His voice was wildly unhinged, completely cracking and echoing violently off the towering, vaulted ceilings. He frantically pointed a shaking finger toward the heavy swinging doors that led directly into the estate kitchens. "I want security in here right now. Call the police. Call the local authorities immediately. I want this violent trespasser physically removed from my property this exact second." The dining room instantly erupted into absolute terrifying chaos. The sheer shocking volume of Bradley's frantic screaming completely shattered the remaining tension in the room. Aunt Susan let out a loud, high-pitched shriek of genuine alarm, pushing her chair back forcefully from the table. Uncle Robert jumped to his feet, knocking over his crystal water glass, the cold liquid spilling rapidly across the pristine white linen tablecloth. Several of my younger cousins began shouting over each other, completely confused by the sudden, aggressive escalation. Jessica aggressively grabbed Greg by his expensive suit arm, physically pulling him backward, her eyes wide with total shock at Bradley's sudden, hysterical meltdown. Even my father Richard looked completely caught off guard. He stood frozen at the head of the table, his face a complex mixture of blinding anger toward me and deep, profound confusion over Bradley's completely unhinged, panicked reaction. "He is threatening us," Bradley continued to scream wildly, his voice growing even more shrill and desperate as he completely lost his grip on reality. He grabbed the back of his velvet dining chair and aggressively shoved it out of his way. "Get him out of my house. Someone call the police right now. He is completely insane. He is trying to extort me. He is a dangerous, violent failure, and I want him arrested immediately." A tall, broad-shouldered catering manager in a crisp white shirt tentatively pushed open the heavy wooden doors leading from the kitchen. He stepped into the formal dining room looking absolutely terrified by the screaming, chaotic scene unfolding before him. He was holding a black cell phone in his hand, clearly unsure if he was actually supposed to dial the emergency authorities or simply run away from the wealthy family's violent meltdown. "Do it!" my father roared suddenly, snapping out of his temporary confusion and firmly siding with his favorite son. Richard pointed an angry, commanding finger directly at the terrified catering manager. "You heard my son. Call the police right now. Tell them we have a hostile, unwanted trespasser who is violently refusing to leave the premises. Have him dragged out of here in handcuffs." The catering manager swallowed hard, his eyes wide with fear, and frantically began to unlock the screen of his cellular phone. Bradley was breathing incredibly heavily, his face slick with nervous sweat, practically vibrating with desperate, panicked energy. He glared at me with a look of pure, cornered malice, firmly believing that his extreme, aggressive volume had successfully silenced me. He truly believed he was about to watch the police physically drag me out the front doors, permanently preserving his massive, fraudulent lie. I remained perfectly seated in my chair amidst the deafening, swirling chaos. I did not panic. I did not yell back. I simply watched the pathetic, desperate implosion of my brother's fake reality with total, unwavering calm. I knew that I did not need to speak over his frantic screaming to win this battle. I knew that the absolute truth did not need a loud, aggressive voice to completely destroy a room full of arrogant lies. The catering manager raised his phone toward his ear, preparing to dial the emergency authorities. Bradley let out a shaky, triumphant breath, fully believing he had secured his ultimate victory. My father stood tall at the head of the table, glaring down at me with absolute, consuming disgust. But before the catering manager could even press a single button on his phone, a new sound violently pierced the chaotic, screaming atmosphere of the dining room. It was a single, incredibly sharp, overwhelmingly loud sound. It was the distinct, unmistakable noise of solid, heavy wood striking directly against polished mahogany. Crack! The sharp, violent noise echoed powerfully off the tall, vaulted ceilings, instantly cutting right through the frantic shouting and the nervous, overlapping conversations of the extended family. It sounded exactly like a heavy gunshot firing inside a closed, highly pressurized room. The entire dining room instantly froze. The terrified catering manager slowly lowered his phone away from his ear. Aunt Susan stopped her frantic gasping. Uncle Robert stood perfectly still next to his spilled glass of water. Jessica and Greg turned their heads sharply toward the far end of the long table. My father, Richard, stopped glaring at me and quickly shifted his aggressive focus. Bradley's frantic, heavy breathing hitched abruptly in his throat as he slowly, nervously turned around. The deafening silence returned to the massive room, heavier and far more oppressive than ever before. At the complete opposite end of the long mahogany table, my grandfather Winston had placed the heavy brass-tipped end of his solid oak walking cane firmly onto the polished surface of the wood. His frail hands were gripping the carved wooden handle with surprising, unyielding strength. Slowly, deliberately ignoring the dull, persistent pain in his aging joints, Grandpa Winston pushed his velvet chair backward. With absolute commanding dignity, he stood up completely straight, rising to his feet to finally face his arrogant, manipulative son and the terrified, fraudulent grandson who had completely built his life on a mountain of massive lies. The sharp, violent crack of the wooden cane striking the solid mahogany dining table was still ringing loudly in my ears. The sound had completely shattered the chaotic, screaming atmosphere of the room, acting like a sudden blast of freezing air that instantly paralyzed every single person present. The terrified catering manager, who had been frantically dialing his cell phone, immediately dropped his hands to his sides and slowly backed away, retreating silently through the heavy wooden doors and disappearing into the kitchen. He wanted absolutely nothing to do with the explosive family meltdown that was unfolding. The loud murmurs, the toxic whispers, and the aggressive shouts of my extended family vanished entirely. The absolute suffocating silence returned, but this time the tension was no longer directed at me. The heavy oppressive weight of the entire room had suddenly shifted entirely to the far end of the long table. Grandpa Winston stood perfectly upright. For the past 2 years, my father and my brother had successfully convinced the entire extended family that Winston was rapidly declining. They had aggressively pushed a false narrative that his mind was slipping, that he was terribly confused, and that he was nothing more than a frail old man who needed constant heavy supervision. They had used that manufactured diagnosis to systematically strip him of his remaining authority. But as he stood there right now, illuminated by the bright, cascading light of the crystal chandeliers, there was absolutely nothing frail or confused about him. He looked incredibly strong. He looked exactly like the fiercely intelligent, commanding patriarch who had single-handedly built his own business empire decades before my father had ever earned a single dime. Winston leaned slightly forward, resting both of his hands firmly on the carved brass handle of his solid oak walking cane. He did not look at my brother Bradley, who was currently sweating profusely and gripping his chair with pale, shaking fingers. He did not look at my ex-wife Jessica, who had suddenly dropped her smug, arrogant smile. Winston turned his incredibly sharp, piercing eyes directly onto my father Richard. My father was completely frozen at the head of the table. His chest was still heaving from his furious screaming fit, but the blinding, self-righteous anger in his eyes was rapidly being replaced by a deep, profound sense of uncertain dread. He had absolutely never expected his elderly father to publicly challenge his ultimate authority in front of the entire family. "You raise a boy to worship money, Richard, and you act surprised when he lies to you about having it," Winston said. His voice was not loud, but it carried an incredible chilling clarity that sliced right through the dead, silent dining room. He spoke with the absolute, perfectly measured cadence of a judge delivering a highly anticipated, irreversible verdict. There was no shaking in his tone. There was no hesitation. Every single word was a highly calculated, deeply intentional strike, aimed directly at the massive, rotting foundation of my father's entire worldview. My father physically recoiled as if he had been slapped hard across his face. He blinked rapidly, his mind desperately struggling to process the heavy insult. "Dad, what are you talking about?" Richard stammered, his confident, commanding persona completely dissolving into sudden, pathetic confusion. "I am trying to maintain order in this house. David is completely out of control. He is disrespecting Bradley. He is disrespecting everything we have built. You need to sit down before you upset yourself." "I will not sit down," Richard Winston replied, his voice growing even colder and far more authoritative. "And I am not the one who is upset. I am simply tired. I am incredibly tired of sitting at this table year after year, completely silent, watching you systematically destroy your own children because of your profound, sickening obsession with outward appearances." Winston took a slow, deliberate step away from his chair, moving slightly down the length of the table. Every single eye in the room tracked his movement. Aunt Susan was holding her breath. Uncle Robert was staring at Winston with his mouth slightly open in total shock. "You look at David." Winston continued, gesturing his head slightly toward where I was sitting, "and you see a failure. You look at his modest car and his simple apartment, and you feel nothing but intense, burning shame. You have spent his entire adult life openly punishing him simply because he refused to play your toxic, manipulative games. You demanded that he take your money so you could completely control his future, and when he bravely walked away to build his own life on his own terms, you labeled him a parasite. You labeled the only honest man in this entire room a parasite." My chest felt incredibly tight. A thick, burning lump formed immediately in my throat. For 35 years, I had endured the relentless, suffocating weight of my family's intense cruelty completely alone. I had swallowed the insults, accepted the mockery, and quietly carried the heavy burden of being the designated disappointment. Hearing my grandfather, the only man I truly respected, publicly validate my difficult choices and fiercely defend my character in front of the people who despised me was an incredibly overwhelming emotional experience. I kept my eyes completely locked on Winston, silently drawing immense strength from his unwavering posture. "And then you look at Bradley," Winston said slowly, turning his sharp, calculating gaze away from my father and locking it directly onto my younger brother. Bradley physically flinched the exact moment Winston looked at him. The expensive crystal tumbler in his hand shook so violently that a few drops of amber scotch splashed directly onto the pristine white linen tablecloth. He looked like a cornered animal, realizing there was absolutely no escape from the incoming slaughter. "You look at Bradley," Winston repeated, his tone dropping into a deeply terrifying register, "and you see the absolute golden child. You see a man wearing expensive suits, driving imported cars, and aggressively bragging about massive commercial real estate funds. You see a mirror reflecting your own massive ego. But you are completely blind, Richard. You are so blinded by the shiny, expensive wrapping paper that you never once bothered to actually look at the incredibly rotting garbage hiding inside the box." Bradley could not handle the mounting pressure. His severe panic completely overrode his logic. He desperately needed to stop the old man from speaking before the devastating truth was permanently dragged out into the light. "Grandpa, please!" Bradley interrupted, his voice cracking horribly. He let out a breathless, incredibly fake laugh that sounded completely unhinged. "You are clearly very confused. Your memory is slipping again. The excitement of the reunion is just becoming entirely too much for you. You need to rest. Let me call your private nurse to take you upstairs." The utter disgusting audacity of his attempt to gaslight our grandfather in front of 40 people sent a fresh, blinding wave of pure anger directly through my veins. Bradley was actively trying to use the same horrible manipulative tactics he had used 3 years ago to strip Winston of his mental agency. He was trying to publicly paint the man as medically incompetent just to save his own pathetic, fraudulent skin. I tensed my legs, fully preparing to stand up and physically intervene if Bradley took a single aggressive step toward him. But Winston did not need my physical protection. He possessed an emotional power that completely dwarfed my brother's frantic, desperate energy. Winston did not raise his voice. He did not yell over Bradley's pathetic stammering. He simply stopped walking, turned his body completely toward Bradley, and delivered a single silent, deeply crushing look. It was a look of such absolute terrifying authority and profound disappointment that it commanded total instant obedience. It was the look of a true patriarch looking down at a deeply unruly, incredibly foolish child. Bradley's frantic voice immediately died in his throat. He snapped his mouth shut, his teeth clicking audibly together. He physically shrank backward against the edge of the mahogany table, completely defeated by the sheer intensity of that single glare. "I am not confused," Bradley Winston stated calmly, perfectly enunciating every single word so it carried to the absolute back of the massive dining room. "I do not have a slipping memory. I am not having a medical episode. I have simply been perfectly quiet. And in my quietness, I have watched every single disgusting, manipulative thing you have done to this family." Winston turned his attention back to my father. Richard was visibly shaking now, his hands gripping the back of his tall velvet chair for physical support. The solid, arrogant foundation of his reality was cracking rapidly beneath his expensive leather shoes. "Let us talk about the truth," Richard Winston said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "Let us talk about exactly what happened 3 years ago when my heart failed and my personal medical expenses began to heavily drain my modest savings. You and Bradley sat together in your corporate office and you made a highly calculated, incredibly cold business decision regarding my life. You decided that keeping me comfortable was a massive waste of your precious capital." A loud collective gasp echoed from the aunts and uncles sitting around the table. Uncle Robert looked sharply at Richard, his face twisting into a genuine expression of total disgust. Aunt Susan covered her mouth with both of her hands, her eyes darting frantically between my father and my grandfather. The highly polished, socially perfect reputation my father had spent decades building was actively being dismantled brick by brick in front of his most important peers. "That is not true," my father whispered defensively, his voice sounding incredibly weak and pathetic. "We were looking at all available medical options. We were trying to be responsible." "You were looking at a state-run, grossly underfunded facility on the county line," Winston countered immediately, completely destroying my father's weak excuse. "You aggressively researched the absolute cheapest possible location to dump me. You drafted the legal paperwork to rapidly liquidate my remaining personal assets, so Bradley could roll my cash directly into his failing commercial real estate fund. You were perfectly willing to strip away every single ounce of my human dignity, force me into a miserable, depressing room, and leave me there to quietly die just so you could violently balance your own toxic spreadsheets." The absolute silence in the room was now thick with profound, heavy judgment. The social currency of the entire gathering was aggressively shifting. The wealthy relatives who had spent the last hour eagerly nodding along with Bradley's cruel insults and laughing at my expense were now staring at my father and my brother with sheer unadulterated horror. They were ruthless business people, yes, but tossing a sick patriarch into a cheap government facility to steal his remaining cash crossed a major, unforgivable social boundary. Bradley was hyperventilating. His chest heaved rapidly as he looked around the room, making desperate, panicked eye contact with the relatives searching for a single friendly face. He found absolutely none. Even Greg, his supposed best friend and trusted business partner, took a very slow, very deliberate step away from Jessica, physically distancing himself from the toxic fallout. Greg was a predatory investor, but he was not an idiot. He could clearly smell the thick scent of total ruin radiating off my brother, and he was already calculating his rapid exit strategy. Jessica looked completely horrified. Her perfect, glamorous posture had entirely collapsed. She stared at Bradley with wide, panicked eyes, suddenly realizing that the incredibly wealthy, incredibly powerful family she had desperately attached herself to was actually built on a foundation of massive, disgusting lies. But I was not the one who did that. Bradley suddenly shouted, his voice cracking with intense, pathetic desperation. He pointed a shaking finger at his own chest, aggressively trying to salvage his fake golden armor. "I did not put you in that cheap facility, Grandpa. I stepped up. I bought this beautiful house. I spent my own money to save you. I am the one who provides for this family while David just sits there and does absolutely nothing." Winston let out a short, incredibly bitter laugh that held absolutely no humor. The sound was deeply unsettling. He looked at Bradley with a mixture of profound pity and total consuming disgust. "You bought this house?" Winston asked, his voice dripping with heavy, undisguised sarcasm. "You stepped up and used your own massive, successful commercial funds to save your poor grandfather from the terrible fate you originally planned for him. Is that the magnificent story you have been aggressively telling everyone in this room?" "Yes," Bradley yelled, completely doubling down on the massive lie because it was the absolute only defense mechanism he had left. He looked frantically toward our father for desperate backup. "Tell him, Dad. Tell him what I did. I bought this $3 million estate. I am the successful one." Richard forcefully slammed his hand against the top of the mahogany table again, desperately trying to regain a sliver of his lost control over the chaotic narrative. He pointed an angry finger directly at Winston, his face contorted with deeply stubborn cognitive dissonance. He completely refused to believe that his favorite, most successful son was a total fraud. "This has gone entirely too far," Richard shouted, his voice trembling with defensive rage. "You are completely out of line. Bradley is an incredibly successful commercial developer. He saved you from that facility. He bought this magnificent estate to keep you comfortable. He is the only reason you are not rotting in a cheap hospital bed right now." Winston did not flinch at my father's aggressive tone. He simply stood there, radiating absolute, unshakable truth. He looked deeply into my father's eyes, fully preparing to deliver the final lethal blow to the massive house of cards. "You are a deeply foolish man," Richard Winston said softly, his words carrying the heavy fatal weight of an absolute fact. Bradley did not buy this estate. Bradley does not have the money to buy a luxury car, let alone a $3 million piece of prime Connecticut real estate. Your favorite son is a complete, total, and absolute fraud. My father shook his head violently from side to side, actively rejecting the reality presenting itself right in front of his face. He aggressively clung to the false paper trail that Bradley had carefully manufactured to deceive him. "That is insane!" Richard yelled, his voice echoing frantically across the crystal glassware and the fine china. "That is completely impossible. Bradley bought this house. He showed me the official legal paperwork. He showed me the deed of trust." Winston slowly reached his right hand inside the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. Grandpa Winston moved with an incredibly slow, deliberate precision that commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the massive formal dining room. His frail but remarkably steady hand reached inside the breast pocket of his custom-tailored suit jacket. The soft friction of the expensive wool fabric rubbing against his movement was the only sound in the entire room. The heavy, oppressive silence had wrapped around the family like a thick, suffocating blanket. 40 relatives sat completely paralyzed in their velvet chairs. Nobody dared to take a breath. Nobody dared to reach for their crystal water glasses or adjust their expensive clothing. All eyes were completely glued to the elderly patriarch. My father, Richard, stood perfectly frozen at the head of the mahogany table. His face was a horrifying portrait of a man whose deeply ingrained, completely arrogant worldview was rapidly fracturing right in front of his eyes. He watched Winston's hand emerge from the dark fabric of the jacket. Winston pulled out a thick, tightly sealed manila envelope. It was heavy, bulging with folded documents and carried the unmistakable sterile look of formal legal paperwork. For a brief, agonizing second, Winston held the envelope up in the bright light of the cascading crystal chandeliers. He did not say a single word. He simply locked his sharp, piercing eyes directly onto my father. Then, with a sudden, deeply dismissive flick of his wrist, Winston tossed the heavy envelope right down the center of the table. The thick packet of documents hit the highly polished mahogany wood with a loud, sharp slap. It slid rapidly across the smooth mirror-like surface of the table. It breezed right past a silver candelabra, completely ignored a crystal wine decanter, and slid directly into my father's space. It came to a sudden absolute halt, right on top of Richard's fine china dinner plate. The physical sound of the envelope hitting the porcelain echoed loudly in the cavernous room. My father flinched as if a live grenade had just been casually tossed directly into his lap. He stared down at the blank manila envelope. He did not immediately reach for it. His hands remained tightly gripping the high back of his tall dining chair. His knuckles were completely white. I could see the frantic, desperate calculations running aggressively behind his eyes. He was a man who had built his entire identity on the absolute certainty of his own superior judgment. He had spent his entire adult life aggressively separating his children into a brilliant winner and a pathetic loser. To open that envelope meant actively inviting the terrifying possibility that his perfect, infallible judgment was completely, horribly wrong. "Read it," Winston commanded. His voice was incredibly cold, completely stripping away any remaining illusion that this was simply a misunderstanding. "Open the envelope, Richard. Look at the actual, undeniable truth that you have been too incredibly arrogant and too deeply foolish to see for the past 3 years. Richard swallowed hard. The thick lump in his throat was clearly visible. He slowly dragged his eyes away from the manila envelope and looked directly at his favorite son. Bradley was in the midst of a total, catastrophic physical and mental collapse. He was leaning heavily against the edge of the dining table, entirely unable to support his own body weight. His perfectly styled hair was now damp with cold, nervous sweat. His custom slate gray suit suddenly looked entirely too big for his rapidly shrinking posture. Bradley looked back at our father with wide, desperate, incredibly terrified eyes. He gave a microscopic, pathetic shake of his head. It was a silent, begging plea. He was desperately asking our father not to open the envelope. He was begging him to keep the beautiful, massive lie alive for just a few more minutes. But my father was a man completely driven by his massive, fragile ego. His ego absolutely demanded proof. He desperately needed to open that envelope and find a single mistake, a simple clerical error that he could instantly use to prove Winston wrong and permanently validate his golden child. With violently shaking hands, Richard slowly reached out and picked up the thick envelope. The crisp sound of the heavy paper tearing open ripped through the silent dining room. He reached his trembling fingers inside and pulled out a thick, professionally bound stack of legal documents. I sat perfectly still in my chair, my face completely devoid of any emotion, watching the exact moment my father's entire universe burned straight to the ground. Richard unfolded the first set of documents. It was the official LLC incorporation papers and the legally binding blind trust agreement. I had paid my high-priced estate attorneys an incredible amount of money to ensure those specific documents were absolutely bulletproof. I watched my father's eyes rapidly scan the dense legal text. I saw his dark eyebrows knit tightly together in deep, profound confusion. He was desperately searching for Bradley's name. He was aggressively scanning the pages for any mention of Bradley's commercial real estate firm, any signature from Bradley's known financial holding companies, or any proof whatsoever that his favorite son had orchestrated this massive purchase. He found absolutely nothing. Bradley's name did not exist anywhere in the thick stack of incorporation documents. Richard's face turned a horrifying, sickly shade of pale gray. He quickly flipped to the second section of the packet. These were the official property transfer records and the certified deed of trust for the $3.1 million Connecticut estate we were currently sitting inside. Richard aggressively ran his trembling finger down the heavy watermarked pages. He checked the dates. He checked the official county seals. He checked the incredibly specific legal descriptions of the sprawling manicured grounds and the 3-story brick colonial house. The documents were absolutely flawless. They completely proved that the property had been bought outright in full cash, completely bypassing any standard commercial mortgage loans. "This proves absolutely nothing," Richard suddenly gasped, his voice incredibly thin and reeking of desperate, pathetic denial. He looked up at Winston, his eyes wild and completely frantic. "This just shows a blind trust bought the house. It does not prove Bradley lied. Bradley could easily be the anonymous capital behind this trust. He told me he used a private shell company for tax protection purposes." Winston did not even blink. He did not raise his voice to argue with my father's pathetic, clinging delusion. "Keep reading," Richard Winston instructed smoothly. "Turn to the very last page. Look at the certified bank records. Look at the exact source of the capital." Richard's hands were shaking so incredibly violently now that the thick stack of papers loudly rattled and snapped in the quiet room. He fumbled with the top corners of the documents, frantically pushing the heavy deed of trust out of the way. He finally reached the very last page of the packet. It was a pristine, high-resolution, officially certified photocopy of the original cashier's check used to permanently close the massive real estate transaction. I watched my father's eyes lock entirely onto the rectangular image of that check. I knew exactly what he was looking at. I knew the specific layout of the document. I knew the name of the highly exclusive, incredibly secure offshore financial institution printed clearly at the top left corner. I knew the exact staggering string of numbers printed boldly across the center line. $3,100,000.00. And most importantly, I knew exactly whose signature was written in bold, undeniable black ink on the bottom right authorization line. Richard stared at the photocopy. He completely stopped breathing. The total, absolute reality of the situation crashed down onto his shoulders with the devastating force of a falling building. His jaw went entirely slack, his mouth hanging slightly open in a portrait of pure, unadulterated shock. He read the signature line once. He closed his eyes tightly, forcefully, shook his head, and quickly opened them to read it a second time. The ink did not change. The massive, undeniable truth did not magically vanish. The signature did not belong to Bradley. It did not belong to a commercial real estate firm. It did not belong to an anonymous shell corporation. It read in my own distinct, perfectly legible handwriting, David. The sheer suffocating silence in the formal dining room stretched out into absolute eternity. 40 family members sat completely paralyzed watching the powerful, incredibly arrogant patriarch of their family physically crumble right in front of their eyes. Aunt Susan was leaning so far forward in her velvet chair that she was practically hovering over the table. Uncle Robert was staring at my father's horrified, pale face with intense, unbroken fascination. Jessica, my ex-wife, suddenly let out a sharp, incredibly ragged breath. Her eyes darted rapidly from the shaking papers in my father's hands directly over to my face. The absolute horrifying math was finally hitting her shallow, calculating brain. She had spent the last 2 years aggressively convincing herself and everyone else in her toxic social circle that she had bravely walked away from a pathetic, stagnant loser. She had stood in this exact foyer just 20 minutes ago and viciously mocked me for living in a cheap apartment. Now she was staring at a man who had casually dropped $3.1 million in pure cash to buy a massive estate, all while letting her walk away without a single dime. Her perfect, glamorous posture completely collapsed. She looked absolutely sick to her stomach. Greg, the wealthy business partner, took another slow, highly calculated step backward. He looked directly at Bradley, his eyes narrowing with deep, profound suspicion. Greg was a man who survived purely on financial intuition. He was looking at his business partner, the man he had just loudly praised for closing a $10 million fund, and he was realizing that Bradley was currently having a severe panic attack over a simple piece of paper. The shiny, expensive illusion of Bradley's success was rapidly dissolving right in front of Greg's calculating eyes. Richard slowly lowered the heavy stack of documents until they rested flat against the mahogany table. He did not let go of the paper. His fingers were pressed tightly against the photocopy of the cashier's check, as if he were trying to physically absorb the reality of the ink through his own skin. He looked absolutely destroyed. Decades of unearned arrogance, decades of cruel, aggressive favoritism, and decades of publicly humiliating his eldest son had just violently exploded directly in his face. He slowly lifted his head and looked at me. His eyes were wide, completely lost, and searching my blank, emotionless face for any sign that this was a cruel, elaborate prank. He found absolutely nothing but cold, unyielding truth. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply looked back at him with the quiet, overwhelming power of a man who had just won a 35-year war without throwing a single punch. Grandpa Winston did not allow my father a single second of peace. He did not give him time to process the devastating blow, to formulate an excuse, or to try and rapidly spin the narrative in his favor. Winston took his heavy oak cane and struck the floorboards, once producing a sharp, demanding thud that instantly commanded the total attention of the room. Winston looked directly down the massive length of the table, his eyes burning with intense, completely unapologetic authority. "Who exactly paid for this house?" Richard Winston asked. His voice was incredibly cold, completely devoid of any parental warmth or mercy. He was forcing his arrogant son to publicly drink the toxic poison he had been serving to me for my entire adult life. Read the name out loud. I want every single person sitting at this dining table to hear exactly who secured this estate. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out. He physically choked on the words. His throat worked aggressively, desperately trying to force air past his paralyzed vocal cords. To say my name aloud, to publicly admit that the impoverished, utterly despised black sheep of the family was actually a multi-millionaire who had saved the family. Patriarch was a physical impossibility for his massive ego. It was an absolute, total surrender. Read the name Richard Winston demanded again, his voice rising in volume, echoing with intense, undeniable power. "Stop protecting a liar and read the name on the check." My father swallowed a heavy, painful breath of air. He looked down at the paper, his hands trembling so violently he could barely keep the document steady on the wood. He looked at Bradley, who was now quietly sobbing, his face buried deeply in his trembling hands, completely unable to meet our father's devastated gaze. It says my father began, his voice breaking horribly into a raspy, incredibly weak whisper. It says David paid for the house. The dining room instantly erupted into a massive wave of shocked, overlapping whispers. Aunt Brenda let out a loud, genuine gasp of absolute disbelief. Uncle Robert shook his head wildly, side to side, staring at me as if I had suddenly transformed into an entirely different human being. Jessica covered her mouth with her trembling hands, her eyes wide with pure agonizing regret, deeply realizing the massive fortune she had arrogantly thrown away. But as the initial explosive shock of my massive hidden wealth began to settle over the formal dining room, a new, far more terrifying silence began to rapidly form. My father slowly lifted his eyes away from the canceled check. He looked across the table at Bradley, who was completely broken, hyperventilating quietly into his expensive suit sleeves. The deep, profound confusion in my father's eyes slowly morphed into a dark, incredibly horrifying realization. The basic, undeniable logic of the situation was finally penetrating his arrogant, stubborn mind. The pieces of the puzzle were forcefully snapping into place, and the final picture was an absolute nightmare. Richard's breathing became incredibly shallow. His eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror as the massive, destructive truth fully crashed into his brain. If David bought the house with his own money, and Bradley had absolutely nothing to do with it, then a massive, completely devastating question remained. Bradley had spent the last 3 years living an incredibly lavish lifestyle, driving imported sports cars, claiming to close massive commercial real estate funds, and actively showing our father detailed, incredibly complex financial portfolios that supposedly proved his unmatched success. If David's money had purchased the $3 million estate, where did all of Bradley's supposed magnificent wealth actually come from? The horrifying question hung in the stagnant air of the formal dining room. If my own money had purchased the $3 million estate, where exactly did all of Bradley's supposed wealth come from? My father stared at the canceled check bearing my signature, his mind violently struggling to process a reality that completely shattered his entire arrogant worldview. He slowly raised his head, his eyes wide and bloodshot, looking past the crystal centerpieces to stare directly at the younger son he had blindly worshipped for years. Bradley was physically shrinking into himself. He pressed his back hard against the heavy wainscoting of the wall, looking desperately for a way to simply vanish into thin air. He could not make eye contact with our father. He could not look at the 40 relatives who had been eagerly applauding his fake success just 20 minutes earlier. His chest heaved with rapid, shallow breaths of pure panic. Grandpa Winston did not let the deafening silence linger. He was determined to completely excise the deep, toxic rot that had infected this family for decades, and he was using the absolute truth as his scalpel. "I will tell you exactly where your favorite son got his money," Richard Winston said. His voice was perfectly steady, echoing with a chilling, clinical precision that commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the room. He got it from dangerous creditors, predatory lenders, and massive unsecured commercial loans. Bradley has never built a single successful real estate fund in his entire life. He does not own that imported sports car parked out in the driveway. He leases it at an exorbitant monthly interest rate just to keep up appearances at his exclusive country club. He does not own the expensive tailored suits he wears, and he certainly does not own a single square inch of the ground you are currently standing on. My father gripped the edges of the mahogany table so hard his hands physically trembled. He shook his head in aggressive, desperate denial. "That is simply not true," my father whispered. His voice was incredibly hollow, completely stripped of its usual booming authority. "He just closed a $10 million commercial fund this morning. He showed me the preliminary paperwork last night in my study. He has incredible profit margins. He showed you exactly what you wanted to see." Winston fired back instantly. "You raised a boy who realized very early on that the only way to earn your love was to present you with a shiny, expensive trophy. You taught him that human value is exclusively measured by a bank account balance. So when his very first commercial venture completely collapsed 4 years ago, he was far too terrified of your toxic judgment to admit failure. Instead of acting like a man and taking the loss, he started borrowing. He borrowed from high-interest private lenders to cover his initial losses. When those payments came due, he borrowed even more to cover the interest. He built a massive, incredibly fragile house of cards, constantly moving borrowed money from one hidden account to another, desperately trying to maintain the grand illusion of total success. Winston took a slow, agonizingly deliberate step closer to my father. He looked at Richard with a mixture of profound pity and absolute unyielding sternness. Your golden child is not a multimillionaire, Richard Winston stated clearly, making sure every single relative heard the exact devastating figure. As of this morning, Bradley is completely insolvent. He is currently drowning in over $4 million of aggressive, toxic commercial debt. A collective horrified gasp ripped through the dining room. Uncle Robert literally dropped his silver fork, the heavy metal clattering loudly against his fine china plate. Aunt Susan grabbed her chest, completely unable to process the sheer magnitude of the financial disaster being exposed. The incredibly wealthy, highly influential family members who had spent their entire lives judging others based on their net worth were suddenly staring at one of their own who had catastrophically failed their only metric for human decency. My father looked like he had been physically struck by a heavy vehicle. He stumbled slightly backward, his knees hitting the edge of his velvet dining chair. $4 million, my father choked out, his eyes darting frantically toward Bradley. Tell me he is lying, Bradley. Tell me right now that your grandfather is confused and making this up. Bradley opened his mouth, but absolutely no sound came out. He just shook his head pathetically, hot tears of shame and panic finally spilling over his perfectly tanned cheeks. His total inability to defend himself was the absolute confirmation my father desperately did not want to see. But my father's deeply ingrained arrogance required one final desperate layer of denial. He stood up slightly straighter, trying to forcefully gather the shattered pieces of his patriarchal authority. Even if that is true, my father said, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and desperate rationalization. Even if he made some terrible investments and took on some bad debt, Bradley is still a partner at his firm. He still has massive earning potential. I have a very robust retirement portfolio. I have a 30-year corporate pension. If he is in trouble, I can quietly liquidate some of my secondary assets and help him restructure his commercial loans. We can handle this privately. We do not need to humiliate him in front of the entire family. I sat completely still in my chair, watching my father seamlessly transition from wanting to have me physically thrown out of the house by security to immediately offering to bail out the son who had aggressively lied to him for years. The sheer blinding hypocrisy of his favoritism was truly breathtaking. He was perfectly willing to let me starve in the street over my simple refusal to take an entry-level job, but he was instantly ready to burn his own retirement savings to protect Bradley's fragile ego. But Grandpa Winston was already shaking his head before my father even finished his desperate sentence. You truly do not understand the absolute severity of what your son has done, Richard Winston said softly. The chilling finality in his tone made the hairs on the back of my neck stand straight up. You cannot bail him out. You cannot liquidate your secondary assets to save him. Why not? My father demanded, his voice rising in sudden frantic panic. It is my money. I earned it. My pension is fully vested. I can do whatever I want with it to protect my family. Winston reached his frail hand back into the deep breast pocket of his tailored jacket. He pulled out a single neatly folded sheet of heavy legal paper. He did not toss this one down the table. He held it firmly in his hand, walking slowly down the length of the mahogany wood until he was standing directly next to my father's chair. Winston placed the single sheet of paper gently onto the table right next to the canceled check that bore my signature. Because you do not have a pension anymore, Winston said. The words dropped into the quiet room like a massive, unexploded bomb. My father stared blankly at Winston, completely failing to comprehend the sentence. He looked down at the piece of paper on the table. It was a formal, notarized commercial loan agreement from a highly predatory private equity firm. 4 months ago, Winston explained, his voice entirely devoid of any sympathy. Bradley's primary creditors finally came calling. They demanded immediate payment on the massive bridge loans he used to fake his early success. They threatened to expose his total insolvency to his investors and press formal charges for financial fraud. Bradley was completely out of options. He was cornered. So he made the ultimate unforgivable decision to save himself at your exact expense. My father's hands began to shake violently as he picked up the commercial loan agreement. He read the top paragraphs, his eyes scanning the incredibly dense legal terminology regarding secured collateral, liquid asset forfeiture, and immediate default penalties. Bradley forged your signature, Richard, Winston stated loudly, completely destroying the last remaining pillar of my father's arrogant life. He forged your signature on a comprehensive legal power of attorney. He then used that fraudulent document to secretly leverage your entire 30-year corporate pension, your secondary investment accounts, and your private stock portfolio. He used every single dime you have ever earned to secure a massive high-risk commercial loan to temporarily pay off his angry creditors. Richard let out a sound that I had never heard a human being make before. It was a horrifying, deeply guttural noise of pure agonizing devastation. It was the sound of a man's entire soul being physically ripped out of his chest. And because his commercial real estate fund was nothing but a complete fantasy, Winston continued relentlessly. He instantly defaulted on that massive loan last week. The private equity firm has already initiated the asset forfeiture protocols. I received the formal notification from our estate lawyers this morning. It is gone, Richard. The bank owns your entire pension. They own your investment accounts. They own everything. You are completely, utterly destitute. The profound, heavy, poetic justice of the moment was absolutely staggering. Less than 10 minutes ago, my father had stood at the head of this exact table, puffed up with massive, unearned pride. He had looked down his nose at me viciously, calling me a financial parasite. He had aggressively threatened to write me out of his will, blindly wielding his money as a weapon of total control. He had demanded that I beg for a job from his golden child to learn what real work looked like. Now the horrifying reality was laid bare for the entire world to see. I was a multi-millionaire who had secretly purchased the estate we were standing in. And my father, the man who worshipped outward success above human decency, was now completely impoverished because his beloved golden son had actively stolen every single penny he owned to fund a pathetic, shallow lifestyle. Richard slowly dropped the forged loan document onto the table. His legs completely gave out beneath him. He collapsed backward into his tall velvet dining chair, his body entirely devoid of strength. He stared blankly at the crystal chandelier above him, his mouth open, his eyes wide and completely vacant. The powerful, terrifying patriarch of the family had been instantly reduced to a broken, empty shell of a man. The silence that followed was incredibly brief because the absolute reality of Winston's financial autopsy had successfully penetrated the mind of the one person in the room who stood to lose just as much as my father. Greg. Bradley's wealthy business partner had been standing quietly near my ex-wife, aggressively trying to distance himself from the toxic fallout. But Winston's revelation about the fake commercial real estate fund caused a massive, violent reaction in Greg's calculating brain. Greg's face turned a dangerous, explosive shade of red. He completely let go of Jessica's arm, shoving her slightly aside as he took 3 massive, aggressive steps directly toward Bradley. "What the hell did he just say?" Greg roared. His booming voice completely shattered the quiet shock of the dining room. Greg did not care about family drama. Greg only cared about his capital. Bradley pressed his back harder against the wall, holding his hands up defensively in front of his face. "Greg, please listen to me," Bradley stammered, tears streaming down his face. "I can fix this. I just need a little bit more time to move some capital around." "You told me that $10 million fund was fully secured," Greg screamed, reaching out and violently grabbing Bradley by the lapels of his expensive tailored suit jacket. He aggressively slammed my brother against the heavy wood paneling of the wall. The sound of Bradley's back hitting the wood echoed loudly through the room. I wired you $2 million of my own personal capital last week to secure my equity position in that new commercial development. Where is my money, Bradley? Where is my $2 million? Greg violently shook my brother, his face twisted in absolute blinding rage. Bradley was completely sobbing now, his fake tough guy persona entirely gone. He looked incredibly small, incredibly weak, and totally pathetic. It went to the creditors. Bradley choked out between heavy, panicked sobs, his hands desperately grabbing at Greg's massive wrists. I had to pay them, Greg. They were going to ruin me. I was going to put your money right back as soon as the next round of funding cleared. I swear to you. You stole from me, Greg roared, his voice shaking the crystal glasses on the table. You used my investment capital to pay off your personal debt. You absolute miserable fraud. You are going to federal prison for wire fraud, and I'm going to make absolutely sure you spend the rest of your pathetic life rotting in a cell. Greg released his aggressive grip on Bradley's suit, shoving him forcefully to the floor. Bradley crumpled onto the expensive dining room rug, landing hard on his knees. He buried his face in his hands, weeping loudly, completely destroyed in front of the entire family he had spent his whole life trying to impress. Greg furiously pulled his cell phone from his pocket, his hands shaking with violent anger, and immediately dialed his corporate legal team to begin the massive, destructive litigation process. Total unprecedented chaos consumed the formal dining room. Aunt Susan was crying loudly into her napkin. Uncle Robert was aggressively whispering into his phone, likely calling his own financial advisors to ensure his family accounts had not been compromised by my brother's massive fraud. My father remained completely paralyzed in his tall velvet chair, staring at the ceiling in a state of deep, unbreakable clinical shock. I sat perfectly calm amidst the swirling, explosive destruction of my family's toxic empire. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy for my father or my brother. They had actively built this massive house of cards using pure cruelty and unchecked greed. Now the wind of absolute truth had finally blown it down, burying them completely in the heavy rubble of their own terrible choices. I slowly turned my head, pulling my gaze away from my weeping brother on the floor. My eyes naturally drifted across the chaotic room until they landed squarely on my ex-wife. Jessica was standing completely alone near the edge of the dining table. Greg had entirely abandoned her in his furious rush to destroy Bradley. The glamorous, arrogant confidence she had paraded around the foyer just 30 minutes ago had completely vanished. She looked incredibly small, incredibly pale, and completely overwhelmed by the sudden violent collapse of the wealthy social circle she had desperately fought to join. But as the initial shock slowly began to wear off, a new, highly disturbing emotion rapidly replaced the fear in her eyes. I watched her perfectly manicured hands slowly grip the edge of the mahogany table. I watched her shallow, heavily calculating mind desperately begin to process the new, undeniable reality of the room. Greg, her wealthy fiancé, was about to lose millions of dollars in a massive federal fraud case. He was facing years of stressful, draining litigation. The beautiful house in Aspen was a complete lie. The luxurious life she had been loudly bragging about was entirely gone. And then she slowly turned her head and looked directly at me. She looked at the man wearing a cheap, off-the-rack suit. She looked at the man she had viciously called a pathetic loser, and her eyes widened with a desperate, incredibly aggressive, highly calculating realization. I was standing in the center of the absolute wreckage, holding $60 million in completely clean, untouchable liquid wealth. She took a slow, deep breath, artificially smoothing the front of her designer evening gown, and began to take a slow, highly deliberate step directly toward my chair. The massive, formal dining room was completely saturated with the heavy, suffocating stench of ruined lives. Uncle Robert had aggressively lowered his cell phone, his face pale as he realized the sheer magnitude of the financial disaster that was about to hit the family portfolio. Aunt Susan was weeping quietly into her expensive linen napkin. My brother Bradley was still curled into a pathetic trembling ball on the expensive rug, weeping with the hollow, agonizing sounds of a man who knew his entire existence was entirely over. My father remained completely paralyzed in his velvet chair, staring blankly at the crystal chandelier above him, trapped in a silent, inescapable prison of his own making. In the dead center of this absolute financial bloodbath stood my ex-wife. Jessica watched the chaotic destruction of the golden child with wide, deeply panicked eyes. The wealthy social circle she had desperately fought to claw her way into was rapidly collapsing right in front of her face. The man she had paraded around the foyer, the man who was supposed to buy her a 5-bedroom mansion in Aspen, was currently bleeding millions of dollars in a massive federal fraud scandal. Greg was no longer her shiny golden ticket to the upper class. He was a violently sinking ship, and Jessica was a professional survivor who absolutely refused to drown. I watched her posture shift. I could physically see the desperate, rapid calculations spinning aggressively behind her beautiful, shallow eyes. She slowly turned her body away from the weeping mess on the floor and locked her gaze entirely onto me, too. She did not see David, the man she had viciously mocked just 30 minutes ago for driving a dented Honda Civic and living above a noisy laundromat. She saw a man sitting quietly in a cheap suit who was holding a verified cashier's check for $3.1 million. She saw a man who had secretly secured a $60 million buyout. The sheer gravitational pull of my hidden wealth acted like a powerful magnet, drawing her rapidly toward my chair. She took a slow, highly deliberate step in my direction. Then she took another. As she closed the physical distance between us, I watched her expertly arrange her features into a mask of profound, deeply manufactured vulnerability. The cruel, arrogant smirk she had worn all afternoon completely melted away. She forced her eyes to widen, allowing a thin, perfectly timed layer of glossy tears to pool along her lower lashes. She was preparing to deliver the emotional performance of a lifetime. She walked right up to my chair, completely ignoring the 40 relatives silently watching her, and reached out with her perfectly manicured hands. Before I could pull my arm back, her fingers tightly wrapped around my forearm. Her grip was desperate and incredibly hot through the thin fabric of my suit jacket. "David," she whispered. Her voice was incredibly soft, trembling with a thick, completely artificial emotion. Her tone was so deeply sincere that it would have easily fooled any man who did not already know the absolute rotting darkness hiding inside her chest. "David," she continued, leaning her body in so close that the overwhelming scent of her expensive designer perfume aggressively filled my lungs. "I am so incredibly sorry. I was so incredibly wrong about everything. When I saw that bank check on the table, when I finally realized what you have been quietly doing all this time, everything suddenly made perfect sense to me. I was so blind, David. I always knew you were destined for absolute greatness. I always knew you had this incredible, powerful drive inside of you. That is exactly why I pushed you so hard. That is why I was so tough on you when we were married. I just wanted you to finally realize your massive potential." She squeezed my arm tighter, letting a single highly calculated tear trace slowly down her cheek. It caught the light of the crystal chandelier perfectly. "I only said those terrible things in the foyer because I was incredibly hurt." "David," she pleaded, her voice breaking with manufactured sorrow. "Greg was a massive mistake. He manipulated me. He completely lied to me about who he was and what he had. But you, David, you are the most honest, incredibly strong man I have ever known. We were completely meant to be together. We can start completely over. We can share this beautiful life you have built. I never truly stopped loving you." I sat perfectly still, listening to the absolute breathtaking audacity of her lies. I looked down at her hands desperately clinging to my forearm. I felt a sudden profound wave of complete and utter revulsion. This was the exact same woman who had stood in our cramped apartment 2 years ago screaming at the top of her lungs that I was a pathetic, stagnant loser who was actively ruining her youth. She had thrown her wedding ring directly at my chest and walked out the door without a single ounce of hesitation, because she firmly believed I would never be able to afford the luxurious, shallow lifestyle she felt she inherently deserved. Now, simply because a piece of paper on a mahogany table proved that I possessed massive, untouchable wealth, she was perfectly willing to completely rewrite our entire shared history. She was aggressively trying to frame her toxic emotional abuse as some kind of tough love motivational strategy. It was deeply, incredibly pathetic. She truly believed that because I had once loved her, I would instantly fall right back into her trap the moment she offered me a fake apology and a few shallow tears. She severely underestimated the absolute freezing cold clarity that my grandfather had just brought into this room. I did not yell. I did not angrily snatch my arm away from her grasp. I simply looked at her hands, and then I slowly looked directly up into her wide, desperately hopeful eyes. I let the heavy, suffocating silence of the dining room surround us for a long, agonizing moment. I wanted her to feel the total emptiness of my reaction. I wanted her to clearly see that her performance was completely, utterly failing. "Jessica," I said. My voice was incredibly flat, totally devoid of any anger, any bitterness, and absolutely any residual affection. It was the clinical, detached tone of a man analyzing a very simple, very predictable piece of raw data. You did not push me to achieve greatness. You relentlessly mocked me because I refused to sell my soul to my manipulative father. You did not leave me because you thought I lacked ambition. She opened her mouth to argue, to desperately inject more fake tears into the conversation, but I did not stop speaking. I kept my voice perfectly even, driving the heavy, undeniable truth straight through her fragile, calculating chest. You did not leave because I was poor, Jessica, I stated clearly, making absolutely sure the words carried to every single corner of the silent room. You left because you are cheap. The words hit her like a violent physical blow. Her entire body flinched. The fake glossy tears instantly stopped falling. "And my net worth does not change your value." I continued, my eyes locked dead onto hers. "You are exactly the same hollow, incredibly selfish person who walked out on me 2 years ago. The only difference is that now you are a hollow, selfish person, standing in a room full of completely ruined frauds. You do not get to come back just because you suddenly realize I won the game you refused to play. Take your hands off me." She instantly let go of my arm as if the cheap fabric of my suit jacket had suddenly caught fire. She physically stumbled backward, her face turning a deep, horrifying shade of crimson. Her jaw dropped completely open, but she was entirely speechless. The absolute brutal finality of my rejection completely shattered her desperate backup plan. She had completely humiliated herself in front of my entire family, actively begging the man she had publicly discarded, only to be coldly, clinically swatted away like a bothersome insect. As Jessica stumbled backward, another loud voice suddenly cut sharply through the heavy atmosphere. Greg had not completely left the building. He had paused in the grand hallway just outside the dining room doors, furiously barking orders into his cell phone. He had clearly heard every single word of Jessica's pathetic, desperate speech to me. He stepped back into the doorway, completely ignoring the chaotic weeping of my brother on the floor. Greg looked at Jessica with a look of pure, concentrated disgust. He was a ruthless corporate shark who had just lost millions of dollars, and the very last thing he wanted was a disloyal, gold-digging fiancé who was actively trying to jump into the bed of the man who had just indirectly exposed his financial ruin. "Are you actually kidding me, Jessica?" Greg snarled, his voice echoing loudly in the tense room. "I just bought you a $50,000 engagement ring last month. I just promised you a 5-bedroom house in Aspen. And the exact second things look slightly difficult for me, you immediately try to crawl right back to your ex-husband because you think he has a bigger bank account." Greg let out a harsh, incredibly bitter laugh. He shook his head aggressively from side to side. "You completely deserve each other," Greg spat, glaring at both Jessica and my weeping brother Bradley. "You are both absolutely pathetic, desperate frauds. Do not ever call my phone again, Jessica. The wedding is permanently canceled. You can find your own ride back to the city." Greg turned on his expensive leather heel and aggressively marched out of the grand foyer. The heavy oak front doors slammed shut behind him with a massive, booming thud that physically shook the walls of the estate. Jessica was completely destroyed. She stood entirely alone in the massive space between the long mahogany table and the heavy wooden doors. She had absolutely no one. The wealthy fiancé she had paraded around the room had just publicly abandoned her. The ex-husband she had desperately tried to manipulate had completely rejected her. She looked around the room with wild, deeply panicked eyes, but the 40 relatives who had previously laughed at her cruel jokes were now entirely ignoring her existence. She was completely invisible. She slowly turned around, wrapped her arms tightly across her chest, and silently walked out of the dining room, her expensive designer heels clicking quietly against the floorboards as she completely vanished from my life forever. With the toxic distraction of my ex-wife finally removed from the room, I slowly stood up from my velvet dining chair. I did not rush. I did not make any sudden aggressive movements. I simply buttoned the center button of my suit jacket and smoothed down the front of my shirt. The entire extended family held their collective breath. I was no longer the impoverished failure squeezed tightly between judgmental cousins. I was the absolute undisputed owner of the $3.1 million fortress we were currently occupying. I was the sole possessor of a $60 million fortune that completely dwarfed the combined net worth of every single person sitting at that table. I turned my body and looked directly down the length of the table toward my father. Richard was still slumped deeply into his tall chair. He looked incredibly old, incredibly frail, and totally defeated. The commanding, terrifying patriarch who had angrily slammed his fist on the table and demanded my removal was entirely gone. He was replaced by a destitute, utterly broken man who had just realized that his blind worship of a fraudulent golden child had completely cost him his entire life savings and his 30-year corporate pension. I looked down at the expensive rug where my younger brother Bradley was still curled in a pathetic ball. Bradley was rocking slightly back and forth, weeping into his hands, entirely consumed by the massive federal fraud investigation that was about to permanently end his life. He was a complete coward, hiding from the catastrophic consequences of his own massive, unchecked greed. I did not feel any sudden urge to yell at them. I did not want to aggressively scream about the decades of emotional abuse, the constant vicious comparisons, or the absolute cruelty they had subjected me to. Yelling was a tool used by people who desperately needed to prove they had power. I already had all the power. I did not need to raise my voice a single fraction of a decibel to completely destroy their remaining reality. I rested my hands calmly on the back of my dining chair. I looked directly at my father, ensuring he was making complete eye contact with me before I delivered the absolute final verdict. "This is my house," I said. I spoke with absolute unwavering authority. The words were perfectly calm, but they carried the heavy, crushing weight of undeniable legal fact. I bought this estate with my own money to ensure that Grandpa Winston could live out the rest of his natural life in absolute peace. Neither of you have ever had a single ounce of legal right to stand on this property. You used my quiet generosity to build a disgusting, fraudulent fantasy, and that fantasy ends right now. My father slowly blinked his bloodshot eyes. He looked completely incapable of formulating a single word of defense. Bradley simply let out a loud, pathetic sob from the floor. "You both have exactly 30 days. I continued, my voice echoing clearly through the massive dining room. "You have exactly 30 days to pack your personal belongings and completely vacate the premises. I will have my estate attorneys send the formal legally binding eviction notices to this address by tomorrow morning. You will not disrupt Grandpa Winston during this process. You will pack your things quietly, and you will leave." I let the timeline settle heavily into their panicked minds. Then I delivered the final non-negotiable boundary. "If you attempt to damage this property," I stated coldly, looking down at my weeping brother on the rug. "If you attempt to steal anything that does not belong to you to sell and pay off your massive commercial debts, If you take so much as a single light bulb from this estate when you leave, I will immediately press formal criminal charges for theft and property damage. I will hand the interior security footage directly over to the authorities, and I will happily add to the massive legal nightmare you are already facing. Do you completely understand me?" My father slowly, painfully closed his eyes. A single heavy tear leaked out and rolled down his pale, devastated cheek. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod of his head. He was completely broken. Bradley simply curled tighter into a ball on the floor, absolutely paralyzed by fear. I did not wait for any further response. I did not need one. I slowly turned my back on the two men who had spent my entire life trying to destroy my spirit. I walked calmly down the length of the mahogany table past the silent, staring faces of my 40 wealthy relatives. I stopped directly in front of Grandpa Winston. He looked up at me, a profound, incredibly proud smile resting quietly on his weathered face. He gave me one final, deeply approving nod. I nodded back, completely at peace. The long, exhausting war was officially over. I turned around and walked out of the massive, formal dining room, leaving the absolute ruins of their arrogant empire crumbling silently to the ground behind me. 3 months is a very short amount of time in the grand scheme of a human life. But 3 months is more than enough time for a towering monument of arrogant pride to completely crumble into absolute dust. My father and my brother were forced to pack their expensive designer luggage and vacate my Connecticut estate exactly 30 days after that catastrophic family dinner. They did not put up a fight. They did not hire expensive lawyers to challenge my legal authority. When the blinding light of the absolute truth finally hit them, they had absolutely nothing left to hide behind. Today, Richard is living a reality he once considered a fate worse than physical death. He resides in a cramped, incredibly depressing one-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. His 30-year corporate pension is entirely gone, legally seized by the aggressive private equity firm to partially cover the massive commercial loans Bradley defaulted on. The man who used to wear $5,000 custom navy blazers and aggressively tap his heavy gold Rolex on my car window is now wearing a standard-issue polyester uniform. He is currently working as a mid-level retail manager at a big box hardware store just to afford his basic monthly groceries. I have not spoken to him since the night I ordered him out of my house. I do not need to. I heard through the family grapevine that the physical toll of his massive fall from grace has been utterly devastating. His hair has turned completely white. His posture, once so rigidly arrogant and aggressively dominant, is now permanently stooped under the crushing weight of his absolute ruin. He spends his days stocking heavy inventory boxes and dealing with angry retail customers taking orders from regional managers who are half his age. His incredibly inflated ego is subjected to daily brutal humiliation. Every time he has to apologize to a rude customer over a minor pricing error, he is forcefully reminded of the absolute power he used to wield and the foolish way he squandered it. The extended family members who used to desperately seek his approval and drink his expensive wine have entirely abandoned him. Uncle Robert and Aunt Susan will not even return his phone calls. He is entirely isolated, living in a quiet, agonizing purgatory of his own creation. The profound, inescapable irony of his situation is the ultimate poetic justice. He had viciously demanded that I take a humiliating entry-level job to learn the value of hard work. Now, he is the one standing on his aching feet for 10 hours a day performing the exact type of grueling manual labor he spent his entire life brutally mocking. He worshipped the shallow illusion of wealth, and when that illusion shattered, it left him with absolutely nothing but the bitter, agonizing reality of his own foolish choices. As for my younger brother, Bradley, his spectacular downfall was far more public and significantly more destructive. The morning after our family reunion, Greg marched straight into their sleek commercial real estate office with an entire team of highly aggressive corporate litigators and forensic accountants. They completely ripped Bradley's fraudulent financial portfolio to absolute shreds. They uncovered years of deeply illegal activity. They found the forged power of attorney documents, the massive wire fraud, and the heavy embezzlement of investor capital. Bradley had been aggressively running a highly sophisticated, completely illegal shell game to fund his lavish country club lifestyle. The federal authorities were brought in immediately, and their investigation was completely merciless. They seized all of his personal electronics, froze his remaining bank accounts, and publicly raided his pristine commercial office. Right now, the former golden child of the family is currently sitting in a cold federal holding facility, awaiting a massive criminal trial. He is facing dozens of highly serious federal indictments for wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. His team of expensive defense attorneys completely abandoned him the exact second his retainer funds bounced. He has been entirely denied bail because the federal judge considered him an extreme flight risk. Greg is personally ensuring that Bradley receives the absolute maximum prison sentence allowed by federal law, actively working with federal prosecutors to provide every single shred of damning evidence against him. The golden boy, the untouchable prodigy who loudly boasted about his $10 million deals and viciously told me I was consuming his oxygen, is now wearing a bright orange jumpsuit. He eats terrible food off a metal tray and sleeps on a painfully thin mattress in a tiny, heavily guarded concrete cell. The wealthy socialite friends who used to eagerly drink his leased champagne now pretend they never even knew him. His name has become a highly toxic curse word in our extended family. The brilliant, unstoppable commercial real estate shark completely drowned in the shallow waters of his own massive, unchecked greed. And then there is Jessica. My ex-wife had brilliantly calculated her entire life around securing a permanent spot in the upper echelons of high society. She had happily thrown away our 7-year marriage because she firmly believed I would never provide her with the shiny, glamorous lifestyle she felt she inherently deserved. But her shallow, predatory instincts completely backfired. Greg was absolutely humiliated by the massive financial scandal. He was a proud, deeply arrogant investor, and the fact that he had been so easily scammed by his own business partner made him incredibly vicious. He completely severed all ties with Bradley, and by extension, he completely severed all ties with Jessica. He officially called off their highly publicized wedding engagement the very next morning. He kicked her out of his luxury apartment, threw her designer luggage into the main lobby, and immediately canceled all of her high-limit supplementary credit cards. The massive 5-bedroom mansion in Aspen was completely taken off the market. Jessica tried desperately to save her social standing, frantically reaching out to the wealthy friends she had made through Greg. But high society is incredibly ruthless to those who fall from grace. She was instantly and permanently exiled from their exclusive social circle. Her invitations to charity galas and country club dinners completely stopped arriving. In a final, incredibly pathetic act of utter desperation, she actually tried to call my personal cell phone 2 weeks ago. She left a 3-minute-long voicemail, crying heavily, begging me to just meet her for a simple cup of coffee to talk about our history. I did not call her back. I simply deleted the voicemail and permanently blocked her number. She is now entirely cut out of the wealthy world she sacrificed her own soul to join. She is currently living with a distant cousin working a basic administrative job, completely surrounded by the stark, terrifying realization that she gambled away a genuine life with a self-made multimillionaire for a fake, deeply fraudulent fantasy that did not even last a full year. While their highly toxic worlds completely burned to the ground, my world finally became incredibly still. It is late Sunday afternoon. The crisp, cool autumn breeze is gently rustling through the massive oak trees that line the outer edges of the $3.1 million Connecticut estate. I am sitting comfortably on the expansive stone back patio, looking out over the perfectly manicured green lawns and the quiet, beautifully vibrant, distant tree line. The massive property is entirely secure. The heavy iron gates at the front of the long gravel driveway are firmly locked, completely sealing away the chaotic, destructive noise of the outside world. There are absolutely no luxury sports cars parked aggressively in the driveway. There are no screaming voices echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the formal dining room. There are no highly judgmental relatives whispering cruel insults behind their hands, and there is no arrogant father demanding absolute blind obedience. There is only a profound, incredibly beautiful silence. Sitting directly across from me at a small wrought iron patio table is Grandpa Winston. He is wearing a comfortable, thick wool sweater to ward off the slight chill in the autumn air. He looks incredibly relaxed, healthier than he has looked in nearly 5 years. The deep, heavy lines of stress and constant anxiety that used to tightly grip his weathered face have completely faded away. He no longer looks like a frail man waiting to be discarded by his greedy family. He looks exactly like a man who is finally safe, finally respected, and finally home. Resting on the table between us is a beautifully carved antique wooden chessboard. We have been playing quietly for the past hour. The game is slow, deeply thoughtful, and perfectly calm. Winston reaches out with a steady hand and moves his knight forward, executing a brilliant, highly unexpected maneuver that completely traps my bishop. He leans back in his comfortable patio chair and offers me a warm, genuine smile. It is a smile completely devoid of any hidden agenda or toxic manipulation. We do not talk about my father working in a retail store. We do not talk about Bradley sitting in a federal prison cell awaiting his final sentencing. We do not talk about Jessica or the massive fortune sitting securely in my offshore trust. We do not need to speak about any of those things. The absolute truth has already done all the heavy lifting. The horrible, suffocating poison that infected this family for decades has been permanently drained from the property. We simply sit together in the warm afternoon sun, listening to the gentle sound of the wind moving through the trees, sharing the incredible priceless gift of absolute peace. I spent 35 years of my life believing that I was fundamentally broken simply because I did not fit into my family's narrow, incredibly toxic definition of success. I allowed their cruel words to heavily echo in my mind. I allowed their harsh judgments to make me feel incredibly small, totally insignificant, and completely invisible. But sitting here right now, looking at the absolute peace on my grandfather's face, I realize that being the designated black sheep of a deeply corrupt family is not a punishment. It is actually the greatest, most powerful protection you could ever possibly ask for in this world. The miserable people who aggressively mocked my cheap suits and my worn-out car were completely consumed by their own massive, terrifying insecurities. They desperately needed the shiny, expensive wrapping paper because their personal lives were entirely empty on the inside. They happily traded their basic human decency for a temporary illusion of power. Real wealth isn't loud. It doesn't need to shout across a dining room table or belittle others to prove it exists. My father and brother chose the illusion of success, and it cost them everything real in their lives. I chose the truth, and it gave me the only family I ever needed. I know there are good, hardworking people listening to this story right now who are sitting in the exact same dark, cramped rooms that I used to live in. I know exactly how much it physically hurts when the people who are supposed to love you the most look at you with nothing but profound, heavy disappointment. You grind through incredibly long hours. You work quietly in the shadows. You build your beautiful life honest brick by honest brick, while the incredibly arrogant people around you loudly flaunt their unearned trophies. They call you a failure. They call you stagnant. They boldly tell you that you will never amount to anything of actual value. But you must absolutely never let their loud, incredibly fragile egos distract you from your own quiet, undeniable truth. Do not waste a single second of your precious life trying to aggressively prove your personal worth to people who are entirely committed to completely misunderstanding you. Let them laugh at your daily struggles. Let them aggressively mock your humble circumstances. Let them blindly worship their incredibly fragile houses of cards. Because when the heavy winds of absolute reality finally blow, and they always inevitably do, their deeply fake empires will completely collapse into the cold dirt. And you will be the only one left standing completely tall on incredibly solid ground with your dignity absolutely intact. If you've ever been the black sheep of your family, if you've ever been mocked for building quietly while others bragged loudly, hit the like button and share this video. Drop a comment below about a time you proved the doubters wrong without saying a single word. Subscribe to the channel for more stories where the truth always wins.